afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third session of the Weather and Society Conference. And in this third session is called Collecting User Insights. So this session is very much focused on how we engage with users, how do we engage with stakeholders through various social science methods. And this session consists also of a number of sessions, of a number of hours in which we will be, going through, I think, like a richness of presentations and of perspectives from around the world. So we're really happy with the turnout of our session. My name is Machiel. I am a professor at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and together with Carla Mooney of the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia, we'll be running this session with you. And the way that we are running this session is as follows. We will be doing presentations of 10 minutes, so it's shorter presentations. But so it's four presentations, let's say, in a row, in which we collect questions of you also. And afterwards, and after these four presentations, we will be engaging in a panel discussion with the four presenters and the people who are in the call. And the way it has been going so far, let's say during the conference, also stands that if you have a question, please write it in the chat. That's where we register and keep track of questions. That will also the presenters can get back to questions, and that's also where we will be drawing from for let's say for the panel discussions that we will be having in this call. So please, if you have questions, feel free to put them there, and we will pick them up from there. There are three teams, as I already mentioned. We will start with the team of methods, and afterwards in the second hour on services, and finally on a community. So all terms or all teams that I think fit with this general team of collecting user insights. If we can go to the next slide, then you'll see, and I think many of us are already used to this, let's say to the rules of the meeting, so I might not have to spend a lot of time there. I think many of you were also in the previous calls in this week. So please, let's say keep your microphone muted. The space is really for the presenters. If you want to turn on your camera, you can. Please be aware that this meeting is being recorded. And please do not interrupt others. And as I mentioned already, put your questions in the chat, and then the moderators will read them out. So with these opening statements, I would like to I'm very excited to start the first team that I will be chairing on methods. And it's also a pleasure to introduce the first speaker. And the first speaker is Katja Schulze. She will be having a presentation called "The Devil is in the Details: How Survey Design Shapes Research Findings on Weather Warning Preferences." So I would like to very much welcome Katja Schulze for the first presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, and hello everybody. As mentioned before, today I'd like to discuss how specific survey design decisions affect the results we obtain. To illustrate this, I'll draw on results from several surveys conducted in Germany as part of the Wageningen project, which is funded by the Hans-Ertl Center for Weather Research. National meteorological services rely in part on surveys to guide operational decisions. For example, when to issue warnings, which terms to use, or how to communicate with different audiences. But here's the problem. Preferences are not neutral facts. They are shaped by the way we measure them. And this raises the key question: are we measuring public preferences or the effects of our survey design? To illustrate how strongly design can influence in our results, let's look at a seemingly simple question. when do people want to receive a weather warning? We asked this question using the same sample, but 3 different formats. First, we used an open-ended question. So we asked, when would you like to receive a thunderstorm warning? The respondents could state any preferred time in their own words. Second, we used the phase-based format. After we introduced and explained the multi-phase warning system, we asked respondents to select the phases at which they would like to receive thunderstorm information. Here, multiple selections were possible. And third, we used a discrete timescale, where respondents could choose preferred information times from 2 structured lists, first during the week before or during the 24 hours before. And multiple answers were again possible. This design allows us to see whether the operationalization of time preferences influences the empirical result. For the first 2 formats, the open-ended format and the phase-based selection, we observe remarkably similar pattern. The modal preference is for receiving warnings between more than 1 hour and up to 6 hours in advance, and this is followed by preferences for lead times of up to 1 hour. What is particularly interesting here is that the formats differ not only technically, but also conceptually. In one case, we asked about thunderstorm warning, in the others about information. The first format allowed only a single answer, while the others allowed multiple answers. So both the wording and the response logic vary, and yet the overall pattern is strikingly similar. And this could suggest the conclusion we are getting consistent results. The format doesn't matter. However, when we look at the responses to the third format, we find that the emphasis shifts quite substantially. The discrete timescale leads to stated preferences for much earlier time points. Options such as 2 or more days before receive markedly higher support, while very short-term preferences almost disappear. So, in other words, the response format itself significantly shaped the preferences people expressed. Now, let me show you another aspect of this example, the preferred number of warnings. We asked participants to select all time points at which they would like to receive an information about an approaching weather event. The last 2 formats are the same as in the previous example. For comparison, we added a third question from a different survey with a different sample, in which we examined warnings for a high-impact weather event, so not thunderstorm information. The main difference, in addition to the topic and the sample, lies in the structure of the response formats. The first 2 use a single scale, one organized by days, the other by phases. The third uses a 2-part scale, separating options for the week before and the 24 hours before the event. Nevertheless, all 3 formats represent the same underlying time continuum. They simply structure it differently. And we observe that the response formats produce clear differences. In the 2 single-scale formats, whether phrased as a general warning or thunderstorm information and using different samples, the pattern is very similar. Most respondents select only one time point, around 60%. However, the 2-part scale produces a markedly different pattern. Here, the majority selects 2 time windows, one for each scale. This difference suggests that the number of preferred warning time points is sensitive to how temporal options are structured in the questionnaire. Let me introduce another dimension of this problem. So far, we mainly talked about response formats, but here's another crucial question. What are we exactly measuring? In this example, our goal was to identify the most suitable terminology for different warning phases. And to determine what most suitable means and how to operationalize it, we focused on different aspects. One was semantic interpretation. So to what extent are the specific terms associated by the public with phase-specific characteristics such as certainty or lead time? Another one was stated preferences. Which term does the public actually prefer for each phase? And these two dimensions seem closely related. In principle, how people interpret a term and which term they prefer should align. But let's take a look at the results. I'm using the example only of phase 1. The exact meaning of that phase and also the specific German terms here are not essential for the point I want to make. What matters is the pattern we observe and the conclusions we can draw from it. So based on semantic interpretation, the first 3 terms appear to be most suitable for this phase. However, when we look at stated preferences, we see a different pattern. A different term, as you can see here, is preferred by the public. And this leads to the key insight. Meaning and preferences do not necessarily align. They seem to be empirically distinct dimensions. So people do not always choose the term they understand best. They may prefer the one they are most familiar with. Therefore, if we only measure preferences, we may arrive at different conclusions than if we measure semantic interpretation as well. There's one last choice I want to highlight, the structure of the experimental design itself. So we are still examining terms for warning phases, as in the previous example. But here we tested them using both within and between subjects designs. In a within subjects design, each participant evaluates all warning labels and directly compares them. And looking at this chart, we see large differences between labels. For example, these two are rated much higher in terms of perceived certainty than the other labels. In the between subject design, by contrast, each participant sees only one label, which is much closer to real-world conditions. But here, those differences largely disappear. When we look at intended protective behavior, we find no significant differences between labels. And this reflects a well-established pattern. Within subject designs, amplify contrasts, whereas between subjects designs produce more conservative estimates. So wording effects may appear substantial in within subject setups, but become much smaller or statistically insignificant in more realistic between subjects conditions. To wrap up, let me return to the broader message behind these findings. Well-designed studies provide valuable insights into how the public perceive warnings. But those insights depend strongly on how we ask our questions. We have seen that survey and experimental design can substantially shape the responses we obtain. Therefore, carefully considering these choices strengthens the interpretation of our results. Pre-testing helps us identify misunderstandings and refine our measures before we actually go into the field. And using alternative item formats allows us to test whether our findings hold across different ways of eliciting results. This in turn supports more robust policy conclusions. Integrating methodological reflection ultimately improves the quality of warning evaluation. So, methodology is not a technical detail. It is part of the result. And because of that, how we ask does not just shape our findings, it shapes the decisions we built on them. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks a lot, Katja. It's a very interesting first presentation. I think thought-provoking. So please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We will be collecting those as we go along. And Katja, we of course hope you will stay for the panel in the second part of this session. Yeah, thanks a lot. For the second presentation, I would like to call Vicky Heinrich. I saw her already in the call. Vicky, are you there and able to share your screen?
Hopefully that will come up. You can see the presentation, Machiel.
Yeah, yeah, it is. So Vicky, yeah, welcome. You're going to present on adapting the US severe weather and society surveys to the Australian context. So also between different contexts. Yeah, the floor is yours, Vicky.
Thanks, Machiel. So I'm Vicky Heinrich. I'm working as a policy advisor at the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. So we have a small social science and services policy team at the Bureau, which includes 5 permanent staff, 1 on contract, and 3 of us are social scientists, one of whom is Carla, the other co-chair of this session. We sit in the organisation in the team around the community services group and decision support services. So for more than 2 decades, organisations like the Academies of Science in America and the World Meteorological Organization have been promoting the need to integrate social science knowledge and methodologies into weather services around the world. But as we all know, integrating social science roles within national meteorological and hydrological services is quite slow. But our team has been working towards uplifting Bureau services to better support community risk awareness, decision making and public safety. So we got a big step forward in our work when we were awarded funding for our Future Warning Services project from the Australia's National Emergency Management Agency in their disaster risk reduction package. So this gave us resources towards doing some social science research and collecting data to understand how people in Australia access, receive, compare and respond to weather warnings and forecasts, and then how we might better improve our warnings to communicate risk. So evaluation of weather services has traditionally focused on forecast accuracy and post-enter reviews, and while this is important, the approaches tell us little about how people are understanding or responding, their behaviour around warnings, and it does not provide data for understanding how warnings function in Australian context and how we might improve services. So to support this work, we adapted the American Severe Weather and Society surveys from the University of Oklahoma. They carry out these studies annually for NOAA and the American National Weather Services, and their survey materials are freely available on the website shown there. So these surveys started back in 2017, and they focus on how people in America perceive risk and respond to warnings across different hazards. So using an existing theoretically grounded and well-established instrument allowed us to leverage off a large body of research and build on proven measures and tested constructs. This allowed for a more efficient process in developing the surveys, and while we need to tailor to Australian conditions and our cultural context and warning systems, we did not have years to start from scratch. There's also the added benefit of being able to compare to the US studies and longitudinal data. So as I said, we did cut several years off being able to do our research timeline, but by not developing surveys from scratch, but we still need to adapt the materials and measures to the Australian context. We know that people in different communities, cultures and countries understand and respond to weather information and warnings in different ways. We also need to account for differences in political systems and warning services. For example, who has the authority to warn and how they do so can vary between countries, states and even jurisdictions in Australia. This all means that you can't simply pick up a survey material from another country or another context and hope it will work. You might have different biases, questions that don't make sense or are irrelevant, and this can give you poor data and you end up wasting resources and your opportunities. So as we've said, we need to customise the survey and tailor questions to the context you're doing the work in, validate your constructs and check reliability, and target the survey to your objectives and research questions. So we kind of started with a survey of everything. I got very excited, but then we had to think about what's feasible, how long is the survey going to take participants, and started dropping topics to reduce the survey length. And again, after pilot testing, some of the questions and constructs were not very reliable, so we had to adapt the survey questions. For example, even things like the hazards, tornadoes aren't fortunately very frequent in Australia, so we changed that to a thunderstorm warning instead of a tornado warning. Things like weather radio or National Weather Service radio doesn't exist in Australia. if we use sirens for warnings, it's usually around bushfires, not for tornadoes. And even things like the spelling of neighbours, we use Australian English, not American English. So there was a lot of things like that we needed to think about and change. In terms of, I'm not sure what happened there, it skipped a slide, sorry. So we ended up with 4 versions of the survey, focusing on hazards of flood, heat wave, tropical cyclone, and thunderstorm. So this is slightly different to the American context. They have a winter weather survey, which isn't particularly relevant in Australia. And we otherwise aimed to get a sample that was generally representative of the Australian population based on our census, which is the methodology they follow in the US. And we ended up with nearly or just under 4,000 participants across the 4 surveys. And Australia does have quite a lot of people outdoors, particularly for their recreational activities. So there's a lot of exposure to weather conditions, and about 66% of people or someone close to them had experienced injury or impact from a weather event during their lives. Most frequently, that was around wind, rainfall, or thunderstorms. So we adapt or use the same risk perception scales around perceptions of risk for different hazards. Obviously, this is different in Australia with heatwave topping out in the most hazardous weather based on people's perceptions from a low to high risk. So it was a reasonably basic measure. We were also interested in how often people access weather information and forecasts, but we also wanted to know what they were doing with the weather information or how they were using it, as this is part of how you understand the value and also uses of information. So we adapted some questions from other surveys in the US as well as in the UK and asked how often or what people were using information for. Often it was simply knowing what the weather would be like, so that situational awareness, what's happening now, and then a lot of planning. So planning how to dress, your travel, your work activities, and also to a lesser extent for severe weather and emergency response and managing safety and risk. In terms of understanding warnings, a lot of our project work with this funding focused on how to improve warnings or what the future version of the Bureau warnings might look like. So Andrew Taylor, I think, in also presenting in this session, we adapted some of their survey questions around understandability of a warning. So this allowed us to compare our 4 hazard warnings in terms of which is most confusing for people, which do people think could be improved, and flood in this case might be one of the warnings we want to prioritise because that was the warning people found most confusing across the 4 hazards tested. We also had the opportunity, the US studies have a format of some baseline questions and then some once-off or quasi-experimental design questions. So we were able to replicate the study that Mackenzie Croak and the team have done relatively recently, looking at what information is most important along the warning timeline across the different hazards, and does this vary across hazards. We also, again, looking at the Australian context, we do include a weather description or the synoptic summary in our warnings, a very small amount, but that's something that's very important to some people. So we added items and also looked at heat wave, whereas the American studies looked at cyclones and winter weather as well as severe weather. So there's some contexts we'll be able to compare and some that are more unique to the Australian communities. So this funding opportunity allowed us to develop a social science-led project and to carry out proof of concept work. We had to be very adaptable and ready to go basically when the opportunity occurred, and it enabled us to use social science insights to help people better understand our warnings and how communities might be responding. Some of the lessons learned include there's a need for a long-term social science strategy within the Bureau, and having academic partners does help add value. And some of the challenges are around maximising the value of the data set. As I've said, we're quite a small team, so having time, and we get push and pull because we're an operational organisation. We do have many priorities and draws on our time. And also, as has been mentioned, there are social science methodologies, specialist skills, data and software needs. So organising that also takes time. And we would very much aim to make these annual surveys and build longitudinal data sets because, as Mackenzie Crowick says, in the US, having the longitudinal data set is where the value has come from their surveys, and we would very much like to follow in their footsteps. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vicky. Very interesting presentation. I see the applause is coming in as well. And yeah, again, as I mentioned, make sure everybody to put your questions in the chat. We will be picking them up, let's say after the 4 presentations. And we also hope Vicky is available, to answer questions later on in the session. Yeah, thanks a lot, Vicky. Yeah, for the 3rd presentation, we will go to Lisa Vitals. I saw her already, in the call. So Lisa, if you're there, feel free to start sharing your screen and to open your microphone and camera. Because Lisa is going to present on a public opinion research in the Canadian Meteorological Service, leveraging public feedback to define warning and forecast services. And I see the presentation has loaded. Lisa, the floor is yours. We can't hear you yet. I see that you're talking, but we can't hear you. There may be something with a microphone, selecting the right one.
Exactly.
And now we hear you. Very good.
Yes.
Yeah, Lisa.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
What I was saying was switching from platform to platform, the settings all reset. So there we are.
Great.
Anyway, thanks so much for having me. I am a social scientist that works in the operational directorate of the Meteorological Service of Canada, supporting service development, staff engagement, and generally for the past 20 years, bringing a non-meteorological perspective to our work, working pretty much only with meteorologists. So with respect to public opinion research, which is how I'm broadly treating surveys here, because we do more than surveys, instead of creating information based on what we know and decide to share, we're trying to learn from collected feedback what information Canadians want and then how they want it. And so we can use our resources wisely and then address Canadian weather information needs. So these are some of the reasons that we use POR. And as others may experience from their organizations, if they're with governments, we find senior management listens more to public feedback than to our standalone staff recommendations, even when backed by research and other evidence. So it made sense to improve our use of survey tools over the past 5 to 10 years to support our programs and proposals. And we're doing a lot more now than we ever had before. So I'd say it even is increased in the past maybe 3 years. As you can see here, there's a number of challenges in utilizing POR as a support tool. Like other bureaucracies, we have extensive approvals required before POR can occur, and additional layers on that if it's contracted out or if it's of what they call significance, which is sort of like a small p political significance. So climate-related things are significant and just things that might go in the public eye. Weather is generally okay, but sometimes more things are political. We do a mix of in-house surveys using a licensed tool. We have surveys that are paid for by other budgets, bigger than ours. And then we have surveys and focus groups that we have to budget for to be contracted out. So I would say so far the amount that we've spent has been a solid return on the investment for the insights we have gathered. Timing is often an issue. A contract needs to be awarded, executed, and concluded before the end of a fiscal year. And critical time points can occur during holiday times or be subject to political constraints of, like, if there's an election, we can't survey people, that sort of thing. With respect to scope and sampling size, in Canada, we have a relatively small population spread across the second largest country and 5 time zones. We do post-warning surveys, and they access a proportion of those people affected, calculated by postal code. We've done focus groups that have been national and representative, and there's also been omnibus and Privy Council sponsored surveys that are statistically significant national surveys of like 1,000 to 3,500 people. One issue I find as a social scientist working with meteorologists is the lack of value necessarily placed on qualitative research and data. So the focus group feedback that we've had in the past 2 rounds has been questioned as not being representative, rather than taking the validity of the overall sense we get and the quotes and not trying to quantify that X% of them didn't like something in particular. So along with that, we have the trying to ensure consistency for the longitudinal value. It's challenging. Each kind of survey is asking about different products and services that we're working on, but we try with like lists of weather hazards or forecast sources, kind of like what Vicky was saying with, you know, a list of like is it radio and television, but we just make sure it's pretty consistent survey to survey and to stay consistent where we can. So recently we've been able to have the following POR opportunities. Partners refer to both of clients of our services, like the National Defense Department, but also decision makers like local government emergency management organizations. We have these departmental omnibus surveys where our bigger Environment and Climate Change Canada department asks a whole bunch of questions to a whole bunch of Canadians, and we're allowed to put a few weather questions in. So for instance, in March 2025, we were able to ask about severe weather preparation, which discovered that the main source of information for weather-related emergencies are weather apps. That was 81% of the respondents said they use weather apps. So that tells us that, you know, we need to make sure our alerting is really visible in our app and share our alerting data through open data with other app developers, because people aren't necessarily using our app, just apps. These are some of the regular surveys we do annually, where we try to be consistent with questioning year after year to best assess trends. And for the past 2 years, we've been able to do focus groups. So the topics we addressed in the first round, it was because they were difficult to imagine as survey questions, because you needed to have sort of visuals or descriptions, context provided before people could comment. So by using a focus group, the moderator could sort of show and tell and share images and sort of probe their overall understanding. And so those were great for getting the full range of opinions from people on topics, understand the language that people used, and hear from very diverse groups. They were moderated independently by a contractor, but we were able to sit in anonymously and listen to what people said about our proposals. The findings were, of course, not intended to be projectable to like the whole population, but it is data that we got guidance from as development continues on the various projects that we put in front of people. So we got, as I said, we got quotes from people, which I find so valuable, especially as a qualitative social scientist. So here's some of the broad learnings that we had from that round. We saw a definite need for education about our existing alerting system, independent of our proposed color-coded alerting that we had put in front of them. So leading up to last fall's introduction of color-coded alerts, we created a much more extensive communications and education plan around weather alerting, and updated, simplified all our alerting-related web pages. So that was a really valuable lesson that we took from the focus groups, and you know, making sure that our smartphone app was on tap, because that's where people are going to. And looking at the longer range forecast, this is sort of in our early warnings for all early notification topic. We got some learnings from that as well. This past year, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, this most recent round concluded. And this was interesting because not only did we have just general population Canadians, we added groups representing professionals, so people who use weather for decision making in their jobs, ranging from a traffic controller to concrete pourers to energy consultants looking at solar power. We have a pretty broad definition of professionals, and we don't have the final report yet, but the general population, for instance, is as happy to have as much weather information as we can provide, but the professionals are much more strategic about their use of it, and they consult multiple sources. So they saw us as the authoritative source, but professionals consulted more websites, like they were using windy.com or specific sites for lightning or snow or what have you, which was super interesting to hear about. So there's some of the applications that we've had from the different focus groups. Another amazing study that we got to take advantage of about a year and a half ago was through an organization called PARCA, and they surveyed 3,500 people all about weather topics. And according to the PARCA study, 57% of Canadians understand the difference between watches and warnings, but 43% don't understand or think they mean the same thing. So this validated our learning from the focus groups that people don't really understand our alerting system, and it really, behooves us to do a good job of educating and communicating what the alerting is about. And in conclusion, the various POR we've used in the Meteorological Service have really helped us validate some of our approaches, refine our products and services like iteratively as they're being developed, and help understand Canadian perceptions of our information. So we've got a proposal for another focus group for the next fiscal year, and the regular surveys will continue on, and we have a beta website with an associated survey coming out probably in about a month. So we're big on the surveys. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. Yeah, very interesting insights across different types of methods from Canada. Very interesting. Yeah, so again, make sure to put your questions in the chat. I see it's quite active there, so I hope Carla is able to make sense of it for the discussion we will be having soon. But first, we're having a final presentation of Andrea Taylor. So Andrea, I saw you already. Yeah, you started sharing. Yeah, Andreas is going to present on who is getting the message and who isn't. Yeah, we're really looking forward to your presentation. Yeah, like Andrea. So please take it away.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to be talking about secondary data, so data from different sources that we can integrate to try and address questions that we have about whether warnings are being received, whether they're not, and whether we can identify some of the factors that might be associated with members of the public being more likely to receive a warning for a weather-related disaster or not. So this work and my team's participation in it has been funded by the Lloyd's Register Foundation as part of the Turning the World Risk Poll into Action scheme. And indeed, one of the survey data sets that this analysis integrates is one of the rounds of the World Risk Poll, which I'll get onto in a moment. So the motivation for this is perhaps self-evident, but it bears repeating that around the world, national meteorological services are in many cases working to develop more effective public-facing early warning systems. And of course, for a public-facing early warning system to actually be effective, the public need to be receiving warning messages so they can decide how to act on it. So we were really interested in finding out if we could identify some of the characteristics of provision associated with a greater proportion of people receiving early warnings for weather-related disasters that they experienced. So to do this, we have integrated data from two key sources. The first is the World Risk Poll 2023. This is a survey conducted every 2 years since 2019. We looked at this set in particular because it was contemporaneous with the other data set that we integrated. So this World Risk Poll surveyed over 100,000 people across 142 countries. So it's a very large data set. But key for us, it integrates information on disaster experience. So have people experienced a disaster? What type of disaster was it? And whether a warning was received in different formats. So traditional news media, so television, radio, online sources, local authorities, or community organizations. And to get a country level indicator for each of the countries within the data set, all 142, we worked out the percentage of those experiencing a disaster who received a warning, just for disasters experienced overall, and then for specific types of weather-related disaster, so flooding, hurricane, etc. Now, the other critical data set was the WMO's Nowcasting Capabilities Survey, which was led by Paola Salio, Helena Msemo and colleagues, which surveyed representatives from 124 national Met services worldwide. So key to us, this provided country-level data from national Met services on their warning provision. So the coverage, the types of hazards and risks integrated, how warnings are presented, so are categories, colours, visualizations used, the channels used, as well as indicators on user engagement and feedback. Critically, we found that there were 97 countries that appeared in both data sets. So we wanted to bring these two data sets together, firstly to look at the proportion of people across different types of country who receive disaster warnings and how they received them, as well as to identify the gaps and some of the characteristics of warning services that might predict people being more likely to receive them. So I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but I will say that in a prior analysis of the World Risk Poll, we identified 6 robust clusters of countries centered around affluence, concern about weather, and preparedness versus unpreparedness. We'd highlight that cluster 1 in the green represents the most vulnerable countries in terms of being the most unprepared, tending to be the lowest affluence and having the highest concern. Clusters 4 and 5 represent more affluent countries, but with different, we could say, risk profiles and preparedness profiles. And then cluster 6, importantly, the light pink cluster indicates countries that might be lower to mid income, but where rated preparedness and was higher and concern was also more mixed. So in terms of an overview of the proportion of people in these countries receiving a warning, we see, as we might have expected, that those in cluster 1, the most vulnerable cluster, were the least likely to receive a warning overall. Although this doesn't necessarily differ that much from clusters 2 and 3, we see importantly that clusters 4, 5 and 6 were relatively similar in the proportion of people receiving some form of warning, with cluster 6 not being any different from 4 or 5. Now, if we dig down and look at sources of warnings, we see for cluster 1, the most vulnerable cluster, that the predominant form of information was coming from traditional media, and this was far above online and local sources. But we see that for cluster 6, this is a cluster where community organisations represent a particularly pronounced source of warning information that we don't see in other clusters. Now, just briefly digging down into demographic factors, so age and gender, we do see that there is a bit of an age effect when it comes to warning sources. So across clusters, generally younger people more likely to get things online, and for traditional media, it's the opposite across most clusters, with older people being more likely to report that they are getting information from traditional media. So looking at the characteristics of National Meteorological Service provision that correspond with warnings being received, we found a number of things: that there was a positive relationship, and of course we emphasize this as correlational, where with warning categories being used to denote level of risk, this was the main format association with receiving a warning or not. where SMS was used to disseminate warnings, where a national weather app was available, where user feedback was being collected, and where emergency managers were being engaged with. So these were positively related to a greater proportion of people receiving a warning. Interestingly, we saw a negative relationship where instant messaging apps were being used for dissemination. So this wasn't something we expected, but it's perhaps due to Met services in some countries trying lots of different ways to try and reach difficult to reach groups. We also looked at where the gap was when it comes to receiving a warning, where warning systems exist. So I'm not going to go too deeply into this due to time, but we found that the biggest gap when it comes to communication was for events related to heavy rainfall and flooding, and this far eclipsed the gap for other types of hazard. So, in terms of the key findings and recommendations, we find that it's important to be aware that traditional media remains an important source of warning information for many, not just in developing countries, but particularly amongst older populations globally. So while social media and instant messaging platforms remain one way to reach the public, particularly younger people, it's important to continue to be mindful, but not everybody has access to these. We also find that SMS messaging seem to be consistently related to people being more likely to report receiving a warning across different types of country. And then finally, flooding and heavy rainfall is the most widely reported disaster and also the one where the communication gap is the largest. And this was particularly the case for those cluster one most vulnerable countries. So highlighting future research needs, an issue we have is that this is cross-sectional, it's one point in time, and so future research is needed, potentially using the World Risk Poll to track this over time. So do we see a change in the warning gap over time? We also have the challenge that the World Risk Poll only asks people about the one most important disaster they've experienced in the last 5 years, and so people might have experienced multiple disasters. And what we really need to do is disentangle whether people aren't receiving the warnings because the event itself is less predictable, more challenging to forecast, or whether it's something related to the communication chain itself. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks a lot thanks a lot, Andrea. I think we have had I think a great set of presentations, let's say covering issues across countries, within countries, etc. Also, this was also very nice, let's say, international comparison. So that's very interesting. Let's see how we do the discussion. I saw that it was quite active on the chat. Carla, would you be able to pick out a couple of interesting questions for our speakers?
I would. And actually, fantastic speeches, and really good to see lots of lively questions in the chat, although at this moment I feel a bit challenged by it. I think there's a couple around methods. So Katja really elicited a lot of interest from people. And the questions are really specifically about, one question was really specifically about, would your results say that you shouldn't use a two-scale option because it produces results to the other two lead time, different results to the lead time question. So Katja, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, yes, indeed, very, very important question. For this particular question that we were asking, so for lead time, I would actually not recommend to use the two-part scale. I wouldn't use it anymore. Because it seems that it motivates the participants to select one time point on each scale independently, and that regardless of whether they actually want to receive an information in practice or not. So it was more really the scale kind of motivating the people to select the time points. So for this particular question, I would not use that. In general, I would always try to be aware of so-called anchor effects, like the scale that we're using. How far does it set, like the borders, the anchoring effect for what people are actually saying.
Okay, thank you. One thing that's come up a bit in the chat, and I think I'm happy for any of the people who presented to speak to this, but is about actually how do you get the sample and whether there's influence on the response by the way you get the sample, and some of the questions and limitations around that. Katja, you're on screen. Do you want to give us a little bit of feedback from your survey and maybe the other presenters in a minute?
Yeah, the surveys that I presented here, they were all using quota representative data, and we hired a market research studio, market research institute, to use their online panel data. So it was online surveys. That comes with disadvantages. It is not a random sample. It is not, so to say, like really from the methodological point representative. It is the panel they have. So yeah, that's I think a better way, or like me personally, a more preferred where to go would be telephone interviews with really like randomly calculated phone numbers, but that's very costly if you hire an institute doing that. Yeah, it's an important question. I think so far, at least for maybe the others have better insights in that. I have not found yet the best way to collect the data, like the trade-off with all the advantages and disadvantages of the different ways to collect data.
Yeah. Lisa and Vicky, would you like to add something to that question? Do you have anything?
Sure. I would just say one of the things I do worry about is in our organization, we have our main website, okay, weather.gc.ca, and there's all the users of that, but the users of that tend to fall into a certain desktop computer demographic. And then if we publish a survey on that, on a banner on that website, then those people are going to, which is what was in the comment, those are the people that are going to follow that. And like, so they're already like in the tent, converted people that are weather interested. They don't represent all Canadians, which is also why our focus groups have been really great, because kind of like what Katja was saying, we contracted a moderator who subcontracts the recruitment of that and then makes it representative across like our 6 regions of Canada, and there's and bilingually and 2 Indigenous representatives. And so to me, that's why those focus groups are so valuable, because it is much more like nationally representative than our weather clients that are already like on board with us. Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah. Okay.
Self-perpetuating, oh yeah, we're really great on weather. This is the weather we want. It's like, is that the weather everybody wants? I'm not sure.
Yeah, good point. Thanks, Lisa. There's just been a comment from Sally Potter in the chat saying that she hears from emergency managers in New Zealand that they like other interfaces more like Windy.com. Okay, sorry, I thought Sally was going to say something about sampling. Vicky, did you want to say something about sampling, or we'll move on?
I can just quickly that for the survey I talked about, we use a marketing panel, same thing, to have people available, and so we could pay them for their time, and that also helped us recruit to quotas across states, age and gender, so that we could be more hopefully representative according to the Australian population. But we did pilot testing using an email list of our weather enthusiasts and people who are happy to volunteer their time and spend hours doing a survey that's too long. So there's different methods, and I've got a psychology background. We ask questions of first year psych students as part of the way they get examined or get marks. So there's different ways and pros and cons, and there's what's available, what's pragmatic, and what you can afford.
Thanks, Vicky. I think there was some interesting kind of side comments from the presenters about sharing research insights. So there's a question in the chat saying, how do we typically share research insights within our institutions? And I noticed Lisa mentioned something about the challenge of getting cut through with qualitative data. So the question is, do you perceive any challenges or good practices for how social science results can be practically taken up in natural science dominant organisations. So I think all of the panel could respond to that. You're on the screen, Vicky, so you could maybe start.
Thanks, Carla. So I think there's definitely people who get social science and people that need to be brought on the journey, and finding the right story to be able to say, and also opportunities to have conversation about what's robust evidence bases and where is your source of data coming from, particularly when people just want quick answers to a question now. It can be very challenging, and I think that's part of the work we have to do, is try and communicate that and take opportunities to show how that robustness of our methods and our considerations contribute to better quality data and hopefully deeper understandings.
Thanks, Vicky. Lisa, did you want to talk to that? And then, or not so much? You've made your
yeah. No, I can. I would say somebody asked, like, what do I do, or so I just try to say things over and over again, and oh well, we have this research, and oh, don't you remember in this focus group we had this, and that's why I said the quotes are so valuable, because in a report I'll make sure that there's quotes, because again, like the outside public has more weight than the average staff person, unfortunately, and in terms of trying to convince them of the validity of qualitative research. Again, just re-emphasizing and saying, yeah, this is just as valid as your numbers thing that you are traditionally working on, just over and over again. And I think the independently written focus group reports have helped with that, because they're summarizing what these people have said, and so that comes across better. But it is a challenge. We do have a sort of like a lunch and learn presentation series that is sponsored by our training division. And I've gone into that once a year or so to say, oh, here's the POR that we've done. Like, I probably might take this presentation and do it in the next couple of months and bring everybody up to date. They can dial in or they can watch it later. So at least it's getting it in front of people. And then they can always ask.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Just turning that question, I think, now to the two presenters, and Andrea and Katja. I mean, often we as agencies commission you to do sort of research. How do you have any advice, or sort of how do you believe you sort of contribute to the cut through of that sort of information with Met Services? It's a nice hard question.
So, I mean, I think that in Katja's talk, there were some great points that were raised about the effects of how we present questions and how we have to be very, very careful about interpreting what we find there. In terms of feeding through working in a university rather than a Met Service, my perspective has been that it's really a matter of identifying the right people within the Met Service to talk to about the findings that you're obtaining, particularly where the goal of the project that you're undertaking is to provide something that's going to be useful for informing service provision. And in some cases, that could be different people depending on whether the audience is going to be the general public or whether it's going to be emergency responders or somebody else. So I think having the organizational context who are receptive to receiving the information, I mean, it's been very, very helpful in cases where the Met Service itself has been able to employ social or behavioral scientists, because then that's automatically a bridge for collaboration.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. That's a great answer. Katja, did you want to add anything to that?
I absolutely agree with Andrea. I want to mention, like, the one study that I showed about terminology. I mean, in general, we work very, very closely with the DWD, the German Meteorological Service. And the one study on terminology was in very close collaboration with them. That was actually a question raised by the Meteorological Service, and we worked very closely together, like every step of the way. So we did not just sit down and did the survey, but we were really, it took me a while to really understand what is the problem, what really needs to be measured, like what are the phases we're talking about, why are certain terms relevant or not. So always being in touch, and always also question yourself, like question myself, did I really understand what is the problem? And then pick certain methods, and also say, like, for example, the preference, that was what was, we asked them what they want, and then saying, well, that might not get us where we want to go, like this might not get us the results we need. So yeah, finding the right people, the openness, and then be always in touch and discuss, and develop everything together, and also discuss the results together, not give them the final results and the presentation and say, this is what I recommend, but like discuss together, what could that actually mean, and what does that mean to you, and what could the conclusion be.
That's very helpful, thank you. I can see Sally Potter has put in a comment about that. In my 10 years of learning how to do this, bringing in guest presenter is helpful. Doing all sorts of things. Perhaps Sally can talk to that a bit later. I wanted to ask a question, and this really actually goes to what the topic is now, where this is the sort of benefit of academic partnerships between operational organisations like the Australian Weather Service and the Canadian Weather Service. And I know the UK Met Service has formalised these partnerships between universities and the services. I guess my question is, what do you see the challenges and benefits of that to be, to have those more formalised arrangements in place? And maybe catch it if you're not sort of wanting to answer that. Maybe some of the other people on the panel might want to respond. Vicky, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I can say that I think it's very worthwhile, because academia have the time to be able to think sometimes that we don't get in an operational agency, and the different perspectives and specialist knowledge. I think one of the challenges has been able to fund that partnership, because although ideally we'd love people to work for free, it's not very realistic. So being able to fund and having the resourcing, so within the Meta agency, the kind of recognition of the value. We have a lot of partnerships across our physical and natural sciences and model development, but being able to have that capacity and capability across social science too would be amazing. So I think that's something for us to aim with, especially when we see what's happening overseas.
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah. So there's some interesting questions now coming in, and I'm not quite keeping up, about flooding, how flooding was identified as a theme in communication. And in fact, it was interesting because in the session this morning or last night, flooding was identified as an area where there was particular weakness around warning communication. So I guess the question is to Vicky and Andrea, do you see some specific reasons why flooding has got a particular issue to communicate, or is it around the service, or what are you thinking?
For me, it's we need to find out whether it's simply because in some cases some flood hazards might be more challenging to predict than other hazards, such as, say, a heat wave, or a storm, for example. Or whether it is because of the process by which that message needs to reach the intended audience, whether that's an emergency manager or whether that's a member of the public, and that may differ between countries. So something that we did see in the analysis that we did is that while the gap was consistently present across countries in terms of flooding being the thing that affected most people, flooding, heavy rainfall affecting most people, but where the lower proportion of people received a warning, it was very pronounced in sort of, we could say, the most vulnerable countries. I mean, maybe cases where you get severe urban flooding for instance. And so I think that is something that needs to be identified. Is it that the events themselves are more challenging to predict, or is it that there's something to do with the dissemination that's a challenge?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. I think there's Jeff DeCosta is going to be talking about a flood case in the next session, so I'm sure that we'll come back to this theme. Machiel, do you want to pick up now? I think we've only got a couple of minutes left, if there are other questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe a smaller question that I had for Vicky, let's say based on her presentation myself, is that is whether you're planning to also provide feedback to the US survey designers, since you have been working with their setup. You've also maybe discovered some recommendations from working with this. There's also, let's say, how we can help each other in a sense to improve the kind of surveys that we do. Have you thought about that, or are you considering that?
Not formally, but we've definitely had spoken to Mackenzie when I was looking, and email her every now and then. We had her come and do a presentation at the Bureau to talk about some of their data sets. And, we would love to be able to do a collaboration. So that's something we're kind of working towards, to be able to compare. And I think those conversations around some of the political factors, like, Republican, Democrat, and how that influences weather uptake. Political affiliation doesn't really influence weather response and warning response in Australia that we can find when you look at those same kind of cultural worldviews. So there's things like that, that, some were just dropped because other people have looked at it and it's not been a factor. But and some of the measures around information behaviour and self-efficacy haven't translated as well. So I think there's definitely scope to be able to have those conversations, and definitely something we're looking forward to being able to just discuss. I think we all are keen to learn from each other and move forward from there. There's also the fact that some of those data sets, like their tornado survey, they've got 2007, so nearly 10 years worth of data. So they're a bit reluctant to really change the questions a great deal, because then you can't compare. So that's where we had a bit more flexibility. And if you look across iterations, like their flood survey was the first time they did that, was in 2024. So you can see how they've developed some of the language and the terms, and they've tried slightly different wording over time. So that's definitely where, if we're trying to look at comparing between countries, what kind of questions are more generalizable and what kind of questions are really context specific, I think is interesting.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Great. We've reached the time that we had set from the outset for our first session of today. In my view, it was a very rich, like a very rich session with really different perspectives from across the world. Also, very interesting insights from inside some of the systems that are out there. So we really look forward to continuing this discussion. But then we'll be taking a 10-minute break to get some coffee and to spread your legs maybe. Or stretch your legs. So we look forward to seeing you again. Also for the speakers, it might be that there are still very interesting questions out there in the chat. So if you would still want to have a look, it's still there, and for you to consider and to respond to the people. So we'll be seeing you in 10 minutes at 20 past, let's say 8. Looking forward to seeing you then for the next session. Thanks a lot, and see you later.
Thank you, everyone. we just had 4 really fantastic presentations. I'm really grateful to the presenters for all that they did then. And also I really appreciate the amount of questions coming into the chat. So I think that really makes for a rich discussion. So really hope that we can keep that coming on. So I'll just wanted to introduce myself. So my name's Carla Mooney. I'm from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, but I'm also co-chair of the Social and Economic Research Applications Working Group, which has kind of organised this conference. And so, you know, it's really fantastic to see the interest and engagement with the conference so far. Just as I think Vicky mentioned earlier, that I work in the services area of the organisation, so it'll come as no surprise that I'm really interested in the application of knowledge to our service, and that's what the next session is really talking about, is looking at this theme of service, the service, and how can it benefit from the insights that we derive from this social science inquiry. I just want to mention first that I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia, which to the local Indigenous people, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, this place is known as Naarm, and take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of these lands and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So just moving now into the session. We've got 4 lovely speakers, and I'm really happy that we're calling this session User Insights. I think when we were conceiving this session, and Yelma, who's online and also works for a meteorological agency, sort of started to describe, we sort of started off saying, what are we going to do about surveys and how well do they work? So that was the inspiration for this session. So clearly there are really close links between what was just talked about in the previous session and what's going to be addressed in this session. And I think we're already starting to touch on that intersection between academic research and application within agencies who are doing their best really to improve the delivery of services to their communities and to evaluate how beneficial what we're doing is. So just to confirm the same setup as before, that we are going to have 4 speakers who are going to speak for a sort of specific amount of time, and then Machiel is going to collect all the questions and help present and follow up in the panel part. So I will just remind everyone that our first speaker is actually can you go to is there another slide, Isha? My apologies, I can't remember.
No, it's
no.
Yeah.
Okay, so firstly, Machiel's got a busy night, so I want to introduce him, and he's going to present to us a horizon scan of key social and behavioural science research questions for advancing polar forecast information services. So I'll pass to you, Machiel.
Yes, thanks a lot, Carla. I'm moving to presenter mode, I think. Am I?
No, not yet.
Yes. Am I now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks a lot, Carla, for the introduction. Yeah, so we'll be playing double roles here sometimes, but I hope that's okay. What I'm presenting on in the next 10 minutes or so is a particular kind of survey across a much wider group of stakeholders and users that we have been doing in the polar regions. As part of a larger program that is called PCAPS. It is a WMO program, one of the flagships, one of the flagship projects of the WMO World Weather Research Program currently, in which we also, as a social science teams, and we have actually 2 teams nowadays, we're trying to understand what the key social and behavioral science questions are for advancing polar forecast information services. And this is a very basic question, but in the polar regions, particularly relevant because the polar regions are traditionally, scientifically, quite dominated by natural scientists, let's say by natural sciences, and this also sometimes, is kind of reflected in the way that that polar forecasting and also information and forecasting services are being let's say produced and delivered. Social sciences are let's say are quite small in the polar regions, which is what we're trying to do something about. So what is PCAPS? It's really a program that aims at improving the fidelity, the actionability, and the impact of environmental forecasting in both polar regions. And here you see a quick picture of the setup of the program. So we have a quite interesting and important objectives such as inclusivity, let's say services, partnerships, etc., but also the impact of the actual work that we're trying to do. And so, both these services and the sustainability parts of the program are constituted by task teams, and as a first, let's say, attempt to make sense, these two task teams work together to create a survey, what we call an horizon scan survey. So this is you could say a larger scale, let's say qualitative type of survey, in which we're trying to reach the social science, let's say, key questions. And this is based on the work that we have been doing also partly by developing let's say focus group, or let's say open table discussions around what the polar let's say services value chain is and what are the kind of bottlenecks that we face there. And you see a picture on the right there of a workshop we had in Cambridge last year. But also based on earlier work that we have been doing as part of an earlier program, the Polar Prediction Project, in which we were also trying to communicate that just by having more data, more observations, more modeling, we're not there yet, and we are still there. And there are still, particularly in the polar regions, let's say communities and users who are not reached with this information. Back to the story then. So so indeed, what we wanted to ask a much broader group of researchers, of social scientists, also natural scientists, also services people in different math institutions working for these polar regions. What are the most significant challenges that are let's say that are faced? What are the critical bottlenecks along the value chain, and also what are the key societal impacts or outcomes as such of the work that they are doing, and also what current projects are trying to fulfill some of these gaps and bottlenecks that are out there. So we carried out a horizon scan, like as I mentioned already, a qualitative type of let's say working with open questions, trying to reach let's say relevant people, and we do this in a 2-round Qualtrics survey that is really global. So let's say covering both polar regions with open-ended questions on challenges and bottlenecks. We have currently carried out the first round of these of this horizon scan, and that is really also the kind of results that we want to quickly share an overview of the kind of inductive outcomes. And as you see, our sample size is not too big. It tends to be quite challenging for the polar regions to find relevant people. But still we're kind of happy with the geographical spread, at least of the sample, and also the kind of sectors you could say that these different respondents are working in and from, and so really also from research and universities, but also across a range of different types of user groups as well. And we also see that people are coming from different types of also academic backgrounds. Of course, many of them more from natural sciences with maybe experience, let's say over the years into societal issues and maybe more social science issues, but also like a fair share of people with a social science background or with a more cross-cutting background. And overall, it's also very interesting that the people in the sample are quite experienced, are people with maybe decades sometimes of experience in working in polar related, meteorologically related issues. Well, the results then. So what do we find and what is interesting there? So what is when we talk about the most important and significant challenges to improving forecasting, we see that, and maybe this is not surprising for many, that the lack of observations and the lack of monitoring, let's say currently is seen as the most important challenge. The polar regions are really lagging behind when compared to other parts of the world, but also in terms of funding and supporting, for example, but also a range of other issues that I mentioned here around service delivery, around uncertainty and communication, and knowledge gaps. So that's really some interesting types of challenges that are maybe most of them are really upstream, but also partly also downstream the value chain. If we look at what the key research needs are, then it's interesting that I think many of the social science kind of issues are coming back quite strongly, such as a better understanding of socioeconomic and cultural impacts, for example, governance and collaboration, let's say communication and public engagement, indigenous and local knowledge. These are really things that are coming back when it comes to the kind of key research needs. And very interesting also from my point of view, when we look at the kind of outcomes of enhanced services in the polar regions, then maybe it doesn't come as a surprise that this is for many people about safety. So this is principally about safer conditions in the polar regions, but also about better decision making for individuals and for organizations involved. That more information will make people understand how their choices will impact polar change and how that will in turn impact the global population. These are really some of the key things that stand out. But also that outcomes are not necessarily always positive. So we asked them very deliberately about whether services, and this is also interesting in general, I think, whether they always lead to better outcomes or let's say positive outcomes or also negative ones. Are there kind of unintended consequences of better and more services? And of course, very interestingly, let's say there is the risk for more or for increased, let's say exploitation of the polar regions as a result of better information or more access to the polar regions. Or a greater societal, let's say, anxiety. When people know better what is coming and what they are facing, this might also lead to panic, for example, right? But still, very interestingly, when you ask people about negative societal outcomes, they would also say that there are none. So there's also still like a fair share of people who see it as positive only, so to say. So with this, let's say these are just some of the insights that we have gathered so far. We are still working on processing the results, and we're also still looking at conducting a second round, in which we would want to dig further. And what we see is that some of the key research needs are, let's say, around visibility as a key meteorological, let's say, condition, and well, a lack of resolution when it comes to observations. Of course, there's also, yeah, let's say, critical challenges in delivering with regard to funding, with regard to timelines, and also with regard to different types of societal implications that we want to understand further. So with this horizon scan, we are encouraged to undertake, let's say different studies, let's say across the value chain. And it also calls for, really, if you look at some of the words of the participants here, that interdisciplinary work really matters, right? That there are still a lot of parallel, let's say, conversations. So in that sense, what we're doing in the conference this week also really helps, I think, to communicate and to talk, let's say, across disciplinary lines and also across different parts of the value chain. Yeah, with that, I'd like to say thank you. If you would like to know more, or if you would like to get involved, here are some contact details for the work that we are doing in PCAPS. And with that, I think I better close.
Thank you, Machiel. That was a great talk. That was really good. Thank you very much. And you're getting lots of claps, and I'm sure there's going to be some really great questions in the chat. We're going to welcome Jeff DaCosta now from Reading University in the UK, and he's going to be talking about how municipalities integrate national weather and flood alerts with local knowledge, evidence from a nationwide survey of Luxembourg. And I think flooding is very topical, so I look forward to hearing from you, Jeff. Thank you.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me and see the presentation.
Presentation is perfect, and we can hear you well. Thank you.
Very well, very well. Thank you. Yes, so I'm going to do something very little bit different from the abstract that was submitted, but still very topical. So basically what happened is that when I submitted the abstract for this session, this was pretty much still ongoing as a survey. So we didn't really have all the results yet. What I will do now is I will take you all on a little trip to Luxembourg. So basically what we did was we conducted a nationwide survey of all the municipalities. And this also explains the title. There are 100 municipalities in Luxembourg, so there are also 100 different ways to get flooded, which is sort of the conclusion as well that we came to. Important to say is that when we designed the survey, we did not intend to look at flooding only. We looked at all of the hazards, so it was pretty much a multi-hazard type of survey. But flooding was by far, and when I say far, I mean 93% the most concerning hazard for the municipalities. So it only makes sense that this is sort of what we're going to talk about today. A little bit of background before designing this survey. So I'm always going to sort of jump back and forth between the survey and how it was structured and sort of what the finding, like the important things are in that, and also the findings. But basically, before the survey, we conducted an in-depth focus group with a flood-affected community in Luxembourg. And that paper has been published in Progress in Disaster Science. And we sort of found out that there's this whole ecosystem of like how warnings are generated and also implemented locally. It has been described as a shadow system, as it parallels sort of the official or formal warning chain. Three important bits of literature is that governance is really important for shaping disaster outcomes. Then also that local authorities are really central to implementing warnings on the ground. They're usually closest to the populations. And also, thirdly, that some variation is anticipated. So we expect context or geography and so on to influence the way that municipalities act. But we sort of want to see more the mechanism, so more the structure. So beyond the expected variation in anticipatory action of the different municipalities. And so that's really what we're trying to talk about here. Some institutional settings on Luxembourg, and I think this is important for not just Luxembourg, but any system. So basically, there's no sub-national level like that we see in, for example, Canada or Germany or Australia, also in terms of jurisdictions. So municipalities are really the next line of command. So once warnings are issued, they're all issued within the same framework and all sort of have the same legal obligations, and the implementation falls to the 100 different municipalities. In the map that you see on the right, you see the neighboring countries, so Germany, Belgium, France, and the outlines within the country are all the 100 different municipalities. They do have legal obligation for response and preparedness, but it is very broad in terms. So there's a lot of leeway and a lot of interpretation. And it's precisely that interpretation that we wanted to capture with the survey. Then, in terms of methods, something important is the timing. So when to roll out such a survey. So we rolled this out end of October, beginning of November of last year. So well after the 2021 floods, because we didn't want to make it about the floods. It's too long ago to sort of have a lot of meaningful insights about what happened back then. We saw that in the focus group that we ran beforehand. So we use it as a moment in time to see, because there's always a before and a after, right? When there's an extreme event. So just for context, and also the survey closed a day after the new local resilience plan guidance was rolled out by the government. So this gives really a snapshot of the situation before sort of any changes are about to be made operational. Then in terms of the overview, disclaimer first, I would say, is that this has been funded by absolutely nobody, as I'm self-funded. And pretty much at the last few weeks of my PhD. And this also, of course, shaped the scope and everything, but I would say that really important, especially when money is a bit tight and there's not so much opportunity for like delegating work, is partnerships. So we were lucky to have a partnership with Civical, which is sort of a syndicate for all of the municipalities in the country. So they're sort of the voice of the municipalities, a buffer between municipality and national government. And they acted as facilitator. So through them, the invitation was sent out to all of the mayors of the municipalities. And the goal was to have one coordinated response per municipality about the different themes of the survey. So the survey was framed as looking into different pathways to climate resilience in the future, because that's a politically very sensitive topic at the moment here. And we designed the survey, well, first in English and then also in the local languages, so Luxembourgish, French, German. They were sent to all municipalities, and all questions were made mandatory. So there were closed-ended questions, but also I would say about half of the questions were open-ended to get sort of this qualitative nuance within. And what we tried to do is that we got 46 valid responses. So 46 out of the 100 municipalities replied to the survey, which represent about 65% of the total population of the country. We ran some statistics to see whether there was any distribution or bias by size of the municipalities and so on, and we didn't find anything significant. And that's also not topic here, but basically we tried to isolate variables to see to sort of distinguish contextual and system-produced variation in response to warnings. So a big one was whether municipalities had an intervention plan in place for severe weather and floods, whether they used fixed triggers as sort of action, so whether they used color-coded warnings or no fixed level to initiate any anticipatory action, how often they react to warnings, and also the importance of local observations within their decision framework. And the size, the income, the hazard, and so on are all used for context, but not as a main sort of analytical approach. I will skip over this because I covered most of this at this point. So the warning architecture is similar to a lot of countries. So color-coded warnings for stages. The terminology is standardized, so they're all operating within the exact same information. So warnings are kept constant, and they all receive the same access to information and all have the same legal mandates, which is really good way to see sort of the different outcomes. So just some of the results here that are really interesting is that the municipalities that have a plan in place and fixed thresholds are the only ones that replied often in terms of action frequency, in terms of when warnings come in, compared to those with no plan and no fixed thresholds. It's not very surprising in the sense that if I continue, about 70% of all the respondents did not have a plan in place. There's no legal obligation to have a plan or a contingency plan in place. It's pretty much initiative driven, and all these plans look different. So we wanted to erase all assumptions when we got the data of the survey, because just having a plan doesn't necessarily mean that it's better. So the first question was, is a plan important? Are color codes important? And the result is really that yes and no. The combination is important. So if I go back to this one here, so the combination is important in the sense that the plan alone is not really initiating, triggering action based on warnings, and fixed thresholds also not. It's both combined that are more likely to drive action. And the hazard, so I said flooding was the most important one. We also differentiated between river flood and flash flood prone municipalities. So they all had to list the sort of hazard that they're exposed to, and also explain which one of these was the most problematic for them and for what reasons. And within those replies, 93% had flooding as the main concern. And of those, most were flash flooding. And we see here that the first column of the diagram is municipalities that use no fixed thresholds for action. Most of those are municipalities where flash flooding is the main concern. And of those, also most do not have contingency plans in place. So there is a real difference between sort of river flood affected municipalities having fixed thresholds to initiate action versus flash flood. But local observation was important all across the board and all across all hazards and all municipalities. So that was a deciding factor for action in all of the municipalities. Now, just to close, so the way action is organized is really important. And also the context influences the structure, but the structure is embedded within the decision framework. So we need to look at that precise bit. And so what we learned is that we were able to see whether municipalities will have a plan or not, and the large majority, so about 70% of the country, does not. Whether there's a link between action and fixed warning levels, and how often these warnings lead to action. This way, we were able to compare the implementation of the national framework and how warnings are interpreted. And also, this type of survey could really be applied to any national system or system to examine how local decision rules are structured. And there's a little bit more information in two other publications, because other things, that's a bracket we can talk about later. But basically, there was another study done in India, the UK, and in Ghana, where we sort of looked at systemic risk from climate change. We conducted workshops there with populations, so that's another level still of governance. But a lot of the things come back again, like issues regarding ownership of land or ownership of property in terms of what is possible or feasible to do and how we react to warnings. So that was something that I found personally very interesting. But I'm looking forward to the questions later. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Another fantastic talk. Look at those floods of clapping hands. So thank you, Jeff. Can we translate all those clapping hands into some really great questions in the chat, and for this speaker or any of the other speakers? So thank you. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Barbara Summers from the University of Leeds, who's going to be talking about another pretty significant hazard, and actually one that's being highlighted as a need for focus actually across the conference, I've noticed, which is heat health. And Barbara's going to be talking about heat health alerts and warnings in England, a longitudinal study. Thanks. I'll pass to you now, Barbara. I don't know if you're speaking, but we can't hear.
Hello. I'm afraid my screen sharing should have worked and didn't, so I'm not quite sure what went wrong. I do apologise. Let me try again.
Oh no, your screen sharing was perfect before. It was just we couldn't hear you.
Oh right. Oh well, perhaps we can move on in that case. Sorry.
That's all. Thank you.
Are you seeing me okay there?
I'm seeing you, but not your slides.
Okay, so this is what happened before. Yes, I'm not getting the share. The share on Zoom isn't working as I expected. Pardon me. Let me just get this up. Let me try. And doesn't usually do this, but let me just try and sort it out.
Thank you.
And I should be able to share now, hopefully. Is that? Yeah?
Magic.
No?
Thank you.
No, it's sharing the wrong one, isn't it? Let me swap screens.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect. Yeah.
Oh, you've got it.
Yes,
Great.
thank you.
Okay. Well,
go ahead.
Hi, everyone, and sorry for the delays there. I'm going to be looking here at public responses to heat alerts and warnings in England. And we've done a longitudinal study going from 2022 to 2024 in this presentation, though we're carrying on with that too. So previous work in this area suggested that many people in the UK have positive feelings towards hot weather, which seems right in a sense. It's sort of what you might feel if you met people in the street. And there was worries that this might undermine the effectiveness of heat health messaging. There were also previous findings in the UK that heat-related change is less concerning than changes in rainfall. So people are much more concerned about rain and flooding than they would be about heat. Now, these things were done back in the 2010s, early to mid 2010s. So what we wanted to do was to do some further work to try and check how people are responding, but also to run it longitudinally so that we see what the general trend is rather than just a reaction at a time when weather may have been particularly harsh or particularly pleasant. So this is our main series of surveys. Basically, we are looking at 22, 23, 24. 22, there was a lot of extreme weather in July, and the 19th of July in 2022 was the hottest day on record. There was a lot of coverage in the media, and people were very much aware that it was a red weather warning in a lot of areas, the highest level that we have. 2023 had the hottest average temperature on record for June. But as we'll notice, averages hide a lot of information. So none of the days were particularly hot. There were no heat warnings in the summer as a whole. And in fact, we had an issue in trying to follow responses to a heat event each year because there wasn't actually an event carrying warnings over a widespread area every time. So these surveys, the 22, 3 and 24, were held at a later date, not straight after an event, because basically there wasn't a particular event of note. 2024 was even less distinguished. The highest temperature in the UK was in August, which is what we would expect normally. And there were no otherwise notable events. Now, interestingly, 2022 is one of the 5 warmest summers on record in the UK. But all 3 years are in the 5 warmest years in the UK. So when you're looking at things over a year, all 3 years stand out, whereas if you look just at the summer when the weather is meant to be warmer, then we only have 2022. And in fact, one thing we're seeing with increased temperatures on average is that actually we're getting warmer winters. So there's a lot less snow than there would have been, say, when I was a kid, certainly a lot less. So let's see what we find. First, we're going to look at how pleasant people thought the weather was in their particular year. The weather on the hottest day, when there was a true weather warning, was found to be very unpleasant by quite a high percentage of people, about 40%. And overall, 70% found it unpleasant or very unpleasant. And in fact, only 18% found it pleasant. In the other 2 years, though, the finding that the warmest weather was pleasant was higher. So for pleasant and very pleasant, we had 44% of people in 23 and 48% of people in 24 who found the weather pleasant. So the hottest June on record was viewed as pleasant, although the hottest day the previous year was unpleasant. So in a sense, people are responding to hottest months in the way that the earlier research suggested. They're liking the hot weather, but it's about the spread of hot weather across the month rather than having that one particular day or group of days. The typicality, which I put on the right-hand side, again follows a trend from the hottest day in 22 to the more normal temperatures in 24. And we're getting much warmer than usual when we have the heat event in 2022, and more of a spread around, colder, about the same, warmer, as we get to the more usual year in 2024. So we then went to have a look at how people react to the idea of further hot weather in the future and the impact it'll have on the UK and their general climate concern. And this is really the contrasting issue. Do people find the weather pleasant is one thing, but does it affect how they view impacts for the future and indeed the climate in general? So the general pattern is similar across the years, in fact, to a much greater extent on these two graphs. The impact on the UK being seen as negative is thought by 50% of respondents across the years. Climate concerns, predominantly in the concerned and very concerned categories, chosen by 58% or more of respondents, and only 20% were neutral and lower amount unconcerned. So although there's some variation with more people choosing very negative and negative impact when the hottest day was experienced, for example, we are still getting the same levels of worry about the future impacts and of concern for climate in general. So we're not getting perhaps what the earlier research feared, that people would not take climate seriously enough. Interestingly here, it's worth noting the responses to impacts of heat and climate change concern did correlate significantly with how pleasant participants found the weather. So there was the effect predicted or thought likely, but in fact it didn't make an overall difference to the level of concern in the population. They were slightly higher, but not by a meaningful amount. Another thing we looked at was whether people's experience of weather over lifetime affected their responses. The 2020s is the decade when the biggest percentage of participants felt they'd had the hottest summer. And as we had 3 of the 5 hottest years in our survey, that's not surprising. However, when we looked at it for the overall responders, 25% of people thought the 1970s was the decade with the hottest summer. And for those aged 50 or over who would definitely have had some knowledge of it, it was over 50%. An issue that gets a lot of mention in the media as we get hot weather now is that we had a very hot weather event in summer of 1976. At the time, it was the hottest summer in the UK. It had a higher maximum temperature than later years, but it did have colder nights, so it's a different pattern. But it lasted over several weeks. And although participants did think that was the warmest summer, it doesn't make a significant difference to the response to heat impacts and whether they feel they'll be negative, or to the level of climate concern. So having had a bad experience or a good experience with an extreme heat event in the past isn't taking focus away from what's happening now. We also, pardon me, had a look at people's response to heat warnings, and really looking at 2022 when we had the hottest weather, they were likely or very likely to do most of the things that are recommended to protect them against heat. And they were more likely than not to do some of the other things. But some things like changing travel plans weren't possible for all participants because it would have meant them not going to work. Things like avoiding alcohol just don't seem to register as something people find attractive to do. We also found people are keeping quite a high level of trust in heat warnings. It was over 70 over and up out of 100 in all cases. And people would be concerned about hot weather becoming more frequent. And it was about the same median level of concern as for heavy rain and flooding. So the idea that people were more worried about rain, it might be true, especially for individuals in flood-prone areas, but the levels of concern for heat are still there, despite the previous research saying we should perhaps wonder about this. So in summary, the hottest day on record was seen as pleasant or very pleasant by only 18% of people. So although British people might like warm weather, they don't like it that warm. When we get to the warmest June or a summer without records set, 40% of people see it pleasant. So people are liking hot weather, but not too hot. For impact, our results imply that those seeing the weather as pleasant don't see more hot weather as a positive change for the UK. There's still some correlations there, but not enough to alter the overall response in the population. For climate concern, again, people are concerned despite changes in the weather in the year they were surveyed. And although 25% of participants overall still think there was hotter years in the past, 50% if they're over 50, it doesn't affect how they view climate change and the impact of future hot weather. They also were equally concerned about hot weather as other weathers. So I think what we're finding out is that by doing the surveys over time and not straight after a heat event, as some of the earlier work had taken data, we're seeing that overall we are getting positive responses to trying to do something about climate change rather than it being pushed down by an interest in keeping warm. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So we're moving now to our last speaker in this session, Medaya Bestari Praya from the Indonesian agency, the Meteorological Agency, and which I always think of as BMKG, but look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much. You're sharing perfectly.
Thank you. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. And what a great session to be here. And I'm so happy to be here. My name is Mudayu from the Indonesian Agency for Meteorology, Climatology and Geophysics. And today I'll present to you a pilot and also the ongoing project with the title of Evaluating the Effectiveness of Indonesia's Info MKG mobile application, using the user experience or UX analytics to understand user behavior better. In BMKG, we actually have lots of numbers, but we haven't yet known how these numbers are doing before. Therefore, I want to make sense of what's going on, and I'm responsible to analyze these digital services focusing on public impact. And previously, in the abstract submission, I actually compared the quick information versus the weather information. However, just after I submitted it, a significant event occurred, and drawn more into it. So in the study, I decided to use the tropical cyclones in your case, which I think is a better fit for the Weather and Society Conference team. And we'll see how society reacts to severe weather warnings. And as a background, people usually tend to focus on hazard forecasting and modeling when defining success in the alert warning system. Eventually, the alert warning system operates along chains from the observation, forecast, communication, and also decision making. And today we're not looking at the accuracy of the weather models, rather at the digital last mile between communication and decision making, since it's still underexplored in BMKG. And as a context, the Info BMKG mobile application is one of the dissemination platforms that we have, and it's been downloaded over 18 million times for both Android and iOS platforms since its first release in 2016. And currently, as of January 2026, we have approximately 1.5 million active users. And the objective of this project is to evaluate the effectiveness of Indonesia's Info BMKG mobile application and whether the digital experience meets the distinct psychological needs of a population when facing a multi-hazard landscape. As the study uses a case from a severe weather event, which is the tropical cyclone Senyar, it was formed in the Strait of Malacca and moved toward the coast. It triggered a massive and devastating flood across Sumatra, including Aceh, North Sumatra, and also West Sumatra. And the recent update shows the number of deaths keep growing, and around 130 people are still missing. The last time I checked on the dashboard on February 18, 2026, and we saw a trend in the Info BMKG mobile app since the warning of Cyclone Seed 95B issued on November 22nd, till it developed into a tropical cyclone on November 25 to 30. And this presentation will explore the cognitive cost, quote unquote, that users are willing to pay assessing the information to survive. Oh, sorry. Okay, so unlike previous studies that face limitation with self-reported surveys when evaluating the system, we use a dual validation approach. And here we try to answer the challenge of the previous study by Rich in 2020 by collecting and analyzing what people say in survey and complementing it with what people actually do using user experience or UX analytics. And previously, we conducted an evaluation survey from March to April in 2025 and received about 3,000 responses about users' perceptions of the app and treated it as a baseline during this time. And to understand the crisis behavior better, we use data triangulation, observing the aggregated crisis behavior during the real-time event rather than a scenario-based experiment, because the objective is to describe the population level responses rather than connect or establish the direct causality between two populations. And I mapped the survey results into quadrants, with the x-axis here represents the satisfaction from the mean, and y-axis represents importance from the Spearman's correlation. And the importance performance analysis provides some insight. And the first one is the performance. I know the performance here is the very critical bottleneck because it scored lower satisfaction but really high in importance. And I want to address this performance gap directly because, like, even though it may sound like an excuse, but technically it's about data complexity. So our Android vitals shows that around 65% users experience a slow startup time or loading time to the initial display in an average of 2 until 5 seconds compared to other weather category with only 5% difference. And because unlike a standard weather app that just pulls a JSON file or other files, InfoBMKG is performing a geospatial handshake from two databases sources of our main products for geophysics and also meteorology. And consequently, it is the user who pay, quote unquote, the tax, like the time tax, to get the accurate location-based data. And then the second insight is the utility. Yeah, is the strongest driver of effectiveness and scored as a strategic advantage for us. And the strong correlation between these navigation and context metrics likely will explain the ability of users to maintain app session despite the technical friction here. So what do people actually do when crisis strikes? When Cyclone Sanya hit, the engagement time spiked. And here's the nuance. I tried to decode the user journey, considering app notification upload rate, also specific page views observation, and so on. And with those, I assume that navigation during crisis might be different from the usual navigation. And I adopt a final diagram to decode this information seeking behavior. The first level here, people are aware through either directed to the homepage or by clicking the notifications. Well, the notification only showed the head of the message and brings you to the homepage. Therefore, users who take more effort to click the full explanation and will go to the second level. And the third one is actually users' own decision. We can see here in the impact zones, the screen views exploded. And the significant time increases was also shown on the satellite screen, which is in a different menu to access it. So I correlated it with the R value from the navigation and content metric result from the previous slide, which indicates that users were actively moving through the app. And therefore, I categorize these behavior as coping capacity in level 3. And lastly, we'll cover the habitual outcome or adaptive capacity shortly. And what happens after this signal ends? The highlight for the behavioral outcome is this December plateau. While the cyclone dissipated on November 30, the daily active user established a new baseline above 80,000. I think surviving the cyclone itself fundamentally changed users' habit, and users overall were traumatized by it, and leading to a state where checking the BMKG app became their daily routine. And it validates the previous study by Brunzinski in 2025 about the multi-hazard retention theory, because we don't serve weather forecast only, but also a quake, a climate like equality and so on. And the app successfully anchored users, like converting this panic install that peaked on November 27 into a habit and adaptive planning. And to conclude and to answer the research team and the question for how do UX analytics provide actionable insight for the National Meteorological Services, as the research is highly specific to the InfoBMKG mobile application ecosystem and the overall Indonesia socio-demographic context, the strategic recommendation is clear, which is the critical gap lies in the performance or the speed. And I suggest by reducing latency or optimizing the app is the most effective way to pay down the cognitive debt. And that is how we respect the users and to turn that struggle into a decision. And Lastly, we understand that our project is still lacking in many ways because it's still ongoing right now. And currently our team is also still developing a new survey instruments for a wider population, not only the users, but also non-users as well, to capture the need and hopefully to improve user satisfaction. And we're also collaborating with the technical team to address the critical issue for split. I know because both coping and also adaptive capacity are crucial to enhancing disaster resilience. The adaptive capacity should involve long-term observation. While the study only observed like a short period of study, like a week later of the event. And while this project is a descriptive study, to answer the what and to answer the how, it sets the stage for future direction to incorporate not only in the quantitative part, but also the qualitative research, for example, interviews, to fully understand and map users' psychological variable for digital behavior. And I think that's all. Thank you for your attention, and back to you, Carla.
Thank you so much. That's a great talk. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Machiel, you've probably been tracking the chat.
Yes, I have. And even though, there were great discussions on the chat, they were also partly still about the previous, let's say, hour, but that's okay because it's fantastic that people find each other on these kind of themes. But I did manage to distill some questions, and there's still questions coming in. So please, if you have questions, we still might have a chance to discuss them in this. In the next 10 minutes or so. Yes. So maybe a first question is around your question or your presentation, Jeff. The title of your presentation seemed to have generated some interest. 100 ways to get flooded. And there was a question about whether the type of flooding mattered in your view. And maybe something that I would like to add there is whether with the flooding you also meant a flooding of data or of information itself. Is the title speaking to different types of floods, or are you merely talking about different ways of getting flooded, less informed or uninformed, prepared or unprepared? Was that more or less the play on words you have there?
I think the plain words was really more about variation. So the different ways that information impacts someone, a society, a system, an administration doesn't really matter. So it was really about that. And I mean, the 100 was fitting because there were 100 municipalities that were targeted. And also 100 different replies and what is the best sort of way forward. So we're currently working on another paper that I didn't present today, which is different pathways to resilience. So that there's different truths in terms of how a municipality or a level of governance sort of prepares for the future. And so that was also a bit the goal of this title. And of course, flooding, because it was by far the most problematic hazard for all of the municipalities.
Right. Yeah, I see. Yeah, I see. I have a second. I have a question for Barbara as well on your presentation on heat waves. What struck me myself was that it seemed to be also kind of a challenge of a memory, right, of people, very much that is coming through your presentation. So asking them about, let's say to reflect or to compare, let's say experiences of heat is also very much a challenge of whether people are able to memorize or whether maybe it was related to what they were doing at the time, etc. Let's say, did you consider that, or how did you consider that? How to make sense of how people, let's say, take memory or memorize such events over time?
Yeah, well, in the case of the heat alert in 2022, when we had the record hot day, then we did the survey within something like a fortnight of the hot day, and there was a lot of press about it. With the other 2 years, there were no heat alerts of note across a wide range of the UK. So we were asking people after the summer had finished, saying, well, June was the warmest month, or August was. And that would affect things, but it mainly happened because there was nothing happening, which made it particularly difficult. I think if the weather's made a big impact, it does linger. 1976 being remembered as the hottest summer that experienced by 50% of people who experienced it indicates that if it is seen as a severe event, it will actually linger. But it was strange that the weather went downhill across the 3 years so far.
Yeah. And what also struck me was that apparently, let's say, let's say the way that particular types of weather are cultivated are also a very important contextual, let's say, issue. So what you mentioned that in the UK, let's say, hot weather is seen as good, as kind of cultivated as such. So this is. So how long such a culture of cultivating that can stay and can linger? Let's say, do you see that changing as well in the kind of surveys that you do? Is that now maybe something is changing in that respect, in the way that hot weather is being cultivated?
Well, I think in the popular newspapers, shall we say, the more trashy ones perhaps, then it's always a big headline that it's hot weather. And the picture I showed at the beginning of my presentation was a beach during as the summer in 2022. People flock. Britain doesn't have that much sunny weather in recent years, and I think people still appreciate it. But I think the important thing was that despite the fact they like warm weather, they don't like it very warm. They didn't enjoy the hottest day generally, and they still are concerned about climate change. Although there's some association between liking hot weather and their views on climate change, it doesn't make more than about 0.2 of a 1 to 5 scale point. It's very small effect. So I think people are reacting in the right way, perhaps despite wishing it was slightly less rainy all the time.
Yeah. I see. Yeah. Thanks. I also have a question for Medayu. Very interesting presentation. You mentioned how important it is to have research on perceptions, on public opinions, but also on actual behavior, right? And how the platform that you have been using is maybe a way to triangulate, let's say, opinions with actual actions of people. Would there be other ways as well, or are you still just, let's say, very much in the phase of discovering what the platform as such could provide in this case?
Yeah, I think I would say this is still ongoing projects and in the early research, I would say. And I think by the time I learn about this platform, I think we can develop more like how to connect between different populations to integrate and to understand better how actually user perceive of this app, but how also the users actually behave during the crisis or using it daily.
Because sometimes, let's say, interpreting big data also makes us think that we see the actual use, while in fact it might be something else, right? So it's really important to have that combination of different types of results or different types of data, I guess.
Right, right.
Maybe a question in general is a question that was asked by Carla on how important it seems to be the kind of the institutional arrangements of the warnings that you're all presenting on. So from municipal arrangements in Luxembourg to maybe national arrangements in Indonesia. And in the UK. So if like I was just wondering in general if any one of you would like to speak to that, and whether you have a good example of how that makes a difference. I don't know who I could give the word, but maybe Jeff.
If you don't mind reformulating, because I'm not sure I really got the question.
Yeah, so how important or what role kind of the institutional, let's say, setting plays. In your case, it was very striking. I mean, since that Luxembourg has municipalities, right?
Yes.
So how important is that, for example, or the way or the kind of institutional setting of the information service as such?
Well, for our case, it was really important because we are sort of doing system analysis. So we first try to identify what sort of system we're working with, and also the legal mandates and accountability structures before doing sort of any type of survey. So that was the initializing factor, I would say. And in terms of Luxembourg, well, it was super important because it sort of designed the whole survey and study forward in the sense that we worked on the assumption that there is one warning system, like one national warning system, and that it's uniform all across the boundaries of the country. So country system, doesn't matter how you want to frame it, and that the information is kept constant and is the same for all end users in that sense. So that was the premise. And so yeah, I would say the institutional setting is everything when starting this sort of survey, and also for the analysis later to sort of be able to differentiate between expected variation due to context or resources or size of municipalities and so on and so forth. Those are things that are known. So to filter out sort of the more systemic risk, it's really important to be able to identify variables to do this sort of analysis. And that's what we've been trying to do. So the institutional setting was really vital in the beginning to set this thing up. It's sort of the foundation pillar of the study.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, and maybe if we can do a final, because we have to also start closing up, like a final comparison. May I ask you to reflect on that as well? Since in Indonesia, yeah, there are so many different governance levels. Your research also covered such a large, let's say, area. Did you capture or have any interesting insights in these institutional arrangements as well, and the role that they play? Is Medaya still there?
Okay. So, speaking about the organizational context, I think from assumption and so from what I observed, from this whole of action gap, I think there is a lack of breaching nodes, meaning that the information fails to cross from the institutional layer to the community layer, because we have the MKG itself is different to the disaster manager that really worked on site. So I think this gap actually hinders the disaster resilience. So I think we need to collaborate more to address this issue as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I see that. And thanks. So also on my part, I would like to say thank you for everyone involved in this session. We had a few issues with technicalities, but I think still like a very nice scope of different types of contexts and areas. So again, we would like to take a 10-minute break and continue in about 10 minutes with the final session of the of this morning, of this evening, wherever you are. Let's any final words, like Carla from you?
I know that was just to reiterate, Machiel, the thanks for the speakers for doing such a great job, and the range of talks was really interesting. And just to say sorry, we're running a little bit late, but we still think 10-minute break is a good idea. So we'll come back in 10 minutes, 8:50 p.m. my time, but I don't know what time it is for anyone else.
It's different everywhere, so it's very 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, we're
10
back.
minutes. That's better. Thanks.
Okay, I hope everybody enjoyed a good break, because we are already talking and listening for several hours this morning, but we have a bit more to cover in this final session. And in this final session, we're talking about community. Of course, in presentations that we've had this morning, let's say different types of audiences, different types of communities or user groups were already addressed. But in the coming presentations, we will be hearing a little bit more of that. It seems that we will not be having the presentation of Linda Musa Miyeni in this session. So there's, as far as we know, let's say two more presentations to come. Like unless Linda Musa is in the call and was let's say wanted to present it. Let's say now. But for now, we are just assuming that we will be having Jack Thompson and Paula Doetsen for the final two presentations, and then hopefully a little bit more of general discussion with all of you on the issues that were generated. So please also keep the questions coming in the chat. There was a couple of really interesting discussions there also on social media. Maybe we can pick that up also after the final two presentations. So I would like to, I think, invite Jack Thompson for his contribution. And so, Jack, if you're there, yes, you are fantastic. If you were able to share, we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can, and
Okay.
we see your presentation.
Okay, great. Thank
as
you.
well.
Good morning. It's very topical. It's a grey, rainy day here in the UK. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Leeds. I work with Andrea, who presented in the first session, and Barbara, who presented in the last presentation. Our project at Leeds is a Lloyd's Register Foundation funded project, and the work that I'll be presenting is from the first phase of that. So my work will be looking at the overall predictors and kind of contextual level, so ones that vary by country, of risk perceptions of climate and severe weather events across countries. Methodological approach used is multi-level modeling. So early warning systems are important for disaster risk reduction, and it's important that they're effective. And for these, it's also important to understand the factors that influence citizen risk perceptions across countries. Much of the existing work tends to be country specific and temporally bound. So it might focus on kind of a case study of one or two countries and be just looking at one time frame. This is an overall limitation because it means that we kind of can't understand which factors might be predictive across countries overall against those that might be influenced, that might be country specific, which may be influenced by individual culture or contextual differences, such as the economic situation, governance quality, things like that. So our project addresses this by conducting a multi-level analysis on citizen risk perceptions. In terms of risk perceptions, we look at perceptions of climate and severe weather events, and we do this by integrating individual level data with national level measures into a combined data set. So Andrea already touched on this briefly in her presentation. Our individual level data is a secondary data set, the World Risk Poll. It's a global survey of risk perceptions and safety across a range of topics. We limit ours to climate and weather. So the global data set is an overall survey composed of around 120, 125 countries, each with a sample of at least 1,000 people per country, with larger sample sizes typically drawn from areas with larger populations, so China, India, and the US. And there's also multiple waves, which addresses the problem of temporal limitations, and we get different snapshots at 2019, 21, and 23. So to measure risk perceptions, which are our dependent measures in this, we take a binary measure for climate change threat, which is just how respondents, how seriously they perceive climate change as a threat, where 1 is equal to serious and 0 modeled as not serious. And then our second dependent measure is a respondent's level of worry that severe weather events may cause significant harm. Again, we model people who said they were worried as 1 and otherwise as 0. For our individual level predictors, we just include demographic predictors. So age, gender, education, employment, income quintile, household size, as a approximate measure of whether people have their child, urbanicity, so whether they live in an urban or a non-urban area, and people's individual experience of severe weather events. I believe it's in the past 12 months for that one. So that was the World Risk Poll. So the unique contribution of our project is that we supplement this data by integrating country level measures on things such as climate governance and the economic situation. So in terms of climatological measures, we integrate data from NDAT, including the raw number of climatological, geophysical, hydrological, and meteorological disasters in each country. Those are lagged measures for 2019 and 23. From ND Gain, we use 3 measures, which takes the mid-21st century projected change in heat waves, flood hazards, and sea level rises by 2050 for each country. Governance quality, so just taken from the WGI, where higher scores equals better governance, and then just a log transformed measure of GDP, and we benchmark it to 2019 to account for COVID inflation. In terms of methods, so we use multi-level Bayesian modeling, where we structure individuals nested within countries. And this allows us to address our research question of whether perceptions of climate and severe weather risks are influenced by individual level and national level factors. Models also include random slopes for each of our individual level variables, and this allows this generates separate predictions for each demographic variable by country. and estimation we use via the RMS package in R. We found that the models, with it being a large N and quite complex with a number of random slopes, we utilize Bayesian estimation because the frequentist approaches with our complex structured data set were quite limited. So, coefficient plot, modeling the predictors of whether people perceive climate change as a threat. Um, the uh, the vertical line just indicates the zero along the x-axis. If a predictor for the coefficient is to the right of the line, it means that a given variable is positively related to climate risk perception. And if it's to the left, it's negatively related. So just looking at the demographic variables very quickly, we can see that relative to younger people, older people are more concerned about climate change, which is interesting as an overall predictor. Females view it as more of a threat than males. Secondary and tertiary education more likely to view it as a threat relative to people with with primary. Same with income quintile. So as you get wealthier, your threat perceptions increase. Household size, larger household sizes more concerned with climate change. Same with those in living in cities. Severe weather events, quite strongly related as well. And then for the country level measures, we find that countries with better governance quality have more salient risk perceptions for climate change, and similar to those with projected change in sea level rises. Um, we also generate graphs to look at random slopes, and this, for example, would show where there isn't much variation, where education typically seems to follow the same pattern no matter what country you live in, whereby higher education is related to more salient risk perceptions of climate. This shows the posterior medians for the projected change in flood hazards. So going from no projected change in flood hazards to the most is associated with about a 17-point increase in the posterior probability that people perceive climate change as a threat. Similar pattern with severe weather events very quickly, just conscious of time, so we can kind of see that age and gender matter. Severe weather events way out here as well. So if you've experienced a severe weather event, you're more likely to perceive severe weather as causing significant harm. Here's something where the random slopes are slightly more interesting. So we can see slightly more variation here, where some of the slopes, for example, Japan, somewhere where the slope's slightly flatter. So people have the same risk perceptions, regardless of whether they've experienced a severe weather event. Whereas in some countries, we can see that it's slightly more precipitous. And here GDP was negatively related, so we can see that as a country becomes richer, their perceptions of severe weather events become less salient. So to conclude, our two models find that our individual level factors, as well as country level data on economic, environmental, and governance factors, are important predictors of risk perceptions. Andrew touched on this briefly in her presentation, but these findings have informed our selection of several focal countries via a cluster analysis, where she showed you the map briefly. And these all represent different climate contexts that we're currently using as case studies to test the effectiveness of early warning systems for disaster risk reduction. On the policy side of things, they can also offer insights for crafting effective and also country-specific strategies for climate mitigation and adaptation, and also potentially for national net services to develop early warning systems for severe weather events. And that's it. Thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, Jack. Very interesting. I think macro scale perspective on some of the issues discussed here. Yeah, so please, for the audience, if you have questions for Jack about this presentation, please put them in the chat, and then after the next presentation, we will be able to pick them up. So, Jack, if you can stay tuned, I'm sure we will have a nice question for you later on. Thanks. The next presentation then is from Paula Doetsen. Paula, if you're able to share, yes, I see you're starting to share your screen, and yeah, your presentation is on it's called consistent enough when perceived a conflict between weather and response agency warnings impact risk perceptions and protective action. Yeah, and that's the current title. That's excellent. Yeah, the floor is yours, Paula. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good evening, g'day, as we like to say in Australia. As I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as First Nations owners of the lands where I'm joining you from this evening. And I would also like to acknowledge that while I'm presenting the research today, it is absolutely a collaboration between Queensland University of Technology and the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. And this work was also funded by the Bureau. All of the project members are in the chat at the moment, so hopefully they can answer the hard questions. After today's presentation, I'd love if you could walk away with a bit more knowledge of the Australian warning context, as well as the insights from the research project on where inconsistency and consistency of warnings between different agencies can have an impact on community risk perceptions and the protective action they take. And you'll probably leave the presentation with a few more questions than you started with about the future of surveys in our field of research. So in Australia, we have something called the Australian Warning System. It was established in 2020, and it prescribes fire agencies, state emergency service agencies to design their warnings in a really specific standardized way. There are 3 levels, no matter what the hazard: advice, which is yellow, watch and act, which is orange, and emergency warning, which is red. You can see there's standardization across icons there, irrelevant of what the hazard is, but also really importantly, the calls to action from agencies are standardized across those 3 levels. So if you get an advice in a cyclone, in a flood, in a fire, the call to action will be pretty standard. Now, the Bureau, our National Meteorological Agency, is not actually required to follow this AWS design. So the Bureau was really interested in understanding if they were to adopt some kind of standardization, what impact would that have if they're putting out warnings alongside other response agencies? So to interrogate that, we had to dive into a really specific context, and we looked at severe weather in New South Wales, which is one state in Australia, because every state and territory is guided by different legislation. So in New South Wales specifically, the Bureau is legally required to warn the public for the series of events listed there on the slide, including severe weather, while New South Wales State Emergency Services, or SES, are responsible for managing how the community is responding to that hazard. So managing things like evacuation. So we wanted to interrogate that what would happen if the Bureau was to update their warnings, which if you heard Vicky earlier, you can hear the research behind that. If they were to update them, what impact would using AWS similar designs, what impact would that have when the SES is delivering the AWS designs messages as well in a severe storm? So we created a series of experimental conditions, and we ran that via an online survey. We had 18 conditions. I'm only going to share findings from the paired comparisons. Stay tuned for a paper for more details on the individual warning conditions. Now, what we wanted to understand was if we look, what happens when you have a new Bureau yellow level warning paired with an existing SES advice warning? So similar design mechanisms. What happens to risk and protective action? But also what happens when the escalation of event doesn't match? So you have a bureau yellow level warning matched with an SES watch and act or emergency warning. We also wanted to understand active and non-active pairs. So that means what happens when there is a warning from one agency that is active in the community, but the other agency either hasn't released something yet or they've cancelled their warning. So what happens then? We ended up with over 2,000 respondents. They were people living in Australia over 18 years of age who were part of the Askable Market Research panel. We ended up with a slightly female bias to our sample, but relatively even spread across ages. We had a sample that reported quite high confidence in their ability to read weather warnings. And we found that they were more likely to use official sources of information about severe weather events. But perhaps a little bit differently to some countries, we had a sample that had very high trust in the Bureau and reported also very high trust in state emergency services generally. So quite unique characteristics that you might not find in surveys across the globe. We found that when the escalation level between the Bureau and the SES matched, then the participants saw those warnings as being consistent. So a Bureau level yellow warning and advice SES warning, yeah, they were considered consistent, and that intuitively makes sense. Where the escalation of the event didn't match, the community identified, yeah, these are probably a little bit inconsistent. And you can see there's different severities there. So having a yellow level Bureau with an SES orange, minor conflict, or a Bureau yellow message with an SES emergency warning, major conflict, because it's 2 steps up of escalation. But what's really, really important to highlight at this point is that nowhere across any of those conditions did we see statistically significant differences in people's need for more information. So whether they saw a condition that they believed to be consistent or inconsistent, the inconsistent conditions were not making people think, I need more information. So what does that mean for comprehension? Again, we saw relatively minimal differences across the different paired conditions on how much they understood the message, whether or not they believed the message to be credible, or whether they thought the message was meaningful. So what that means is if the Bureau was to consider some level of standardization across design, it doesn't appear to be introducing any issues when disseminated with the SES warnings that have the AWS design. But what was the impact on risk perceptions and protective action? Well, we found that in pairs that were considered consistent, we saw appropriate increases in risk perceptions. So, of course, the emergency warning SES and the red level Bureau warning paired together was considered more risky, and also people were more likely to take protective action. They were going to cancel their plans because of the severe weather than in the orange-orange pairing, than in the yellow-yellow pairing, which is great. That is what you anticipate and hope you would find. What happened when there were inconsistent pairings? Well, in these conditions, we still saw an appropriate escalation of risk and likelihood to share information, seek information, and cancel their plans. So what we found was in the Bureau yellow level warning paired with an emergency warning from SES, they were more likely to cancel their plans and experience perceptions of high risk than in the yellow-orange to yellow-yellow. Yellow-orange and yellow-yellow. Now, why is this important and what's actually happening here? Well, we found that participants were ultimately attending to the higher level severity message as opposed to being confused by any kind of difference between the two, which is what you would want, because we know intuitively in real life events, people are not just getting information from one source. So it appears that our participants were cognitively able to understand that it was describing an event. Now, you might be thinking, well, would we ever see in reality this kind of major conflict or minor conflict? Yes, absolutely. It is very operationally plausible because the Bureau warning there is saying, here's a severe weather event at a larger geographic scale, whereas SES is focusing more locally on how that impact, what the impact is on that community. But we also tested these active and non-active pairs. Again, very operationally sound and plausible scenarios here. On the left, we have a scenario where the Bureau, who is legally responsible to warn the community in this event, has sent out their first initial warning. It's a yellow level warning, but the SES has not yet sent out their warning. Now, when that happened, we found the community effectively responded with the same level of risk and likelihood to take protective action as if they just received the yellow level Bureau warning, which, okay, that makes complete sense. Great. What happens though towards the end of an event when the Bureau has cancelled a warning, but SES still has an active warning present? Well, in our experiment, because we had specifically made that SES advice say threat is reduced, our participants were able to see these seem in agreement, they're consistent, and therefore had appropriate corresponding risk perceptions. People were more likely to cancel plans in the first scenario there on the left at the beginning of the event than they were in the scenario on the right, which would occur at the end of the event. Again, intuitively, that makes sense because people are aware the event has ended. However, where everything kind of fell apart was when we had an active, non-active pairing where the Bureau had cancelled a warning, which again would happen towards the end of an event, but the SES still had an emergency warning message out to the public. This is when we saw suppressed risk perceptions. This is when we saw people less likely to take protective action. Now, the issue here is the cancelled warning appears to be undermining the severity and seriousness of the SES warning, which is operationally problematic because it could mean that people on the ground are moving out and about in the area and they could be putting themselves in harm's way, which requires, of course, more emergency response. So operationally, there is a huge opportunity here for greater coordination between weather agencies and response agencies, especially at beginning and end of events when there's likely to be timing differences or delays in the messaging that is put out to the community, which is important for any multi-source warning system across the world. But something that became really apparent, and not just in this study, but in any survey research that we have been doing in the field around risk communication and its efficacy, is that a lot of it we rely on market research panels or online recruitment. And we're seeing such an increase in bots getting involved in that research. And there's only so many safeguards you can put in place at the beginning of a survey. It's incredibly time intensive. And then you have all the manual cleaning to do at the end for any that get through. And we're starting to wonder, are we at some kind of tipping point here? Because again, if you're constantly surveying people online, are you getting an exclusive group that you are over surveying? There are people you're never hearing from. And how is that translating to local level insights on the ground for true operational change that reflects what the local community needs? So I pose a question to the group based on everything that we've heard as I'm sort of closing out this session for today. What is the future of survey research? And is there a model that exists and an appropriate resourcing backing to it that would allow more dedicated real-time access to people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors before, during, and after events so that we can actually truly pinpoint how are they consuming warnings in real time and what are they doing with those warnings? So with that philosophical and major question to end the session, I know you've been piqued your interest around the Australian warning system. And from this initial evidence, we can see that the Bureau would benefit from more consistent standardisation. We know that inconsistency is really problematic when there is the presence and absence of warnings, when the community would expect something to be there. And that can suppress risk and lead to non-protective action. But also collectively as researchers in this domain, we need to figure out how to get more active involvement from all groups, all communities to sustain changes to practice over time. So happy to take questions by email or in the chat. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Thanks a lot, Paula. Let's all give her a very big applause. Yes, there it's coming. Thanks a lot. And well, I would like to ask Carla first whether whether there's any interesting questions in the chat for both Paula and for Jack in this session.
Okay. There was some very, so thank you both speakers. There's a couple of questions for Jack, so I might just start with them. So the couple of questions, Jack, were about what are the factors you're including in your consideration? One being political ideology, and the other is taking into account Indigenous and local knowledge as factors of influence on risk perception.
So in terms of some of the measures, we are slightly limited, just because there are measures that aren't available within the data set. So the World Risk Poll doesn't have individual level measures of political ideology, for example. One possibility we looked at was including national level measures. The problem with that is you don't get as much variation as you would with kind of standard individual level measures of ideology. So it'd just be a mean measure of one point in time. There's also countries that can't be necessarily put on the left-right spectrum. So, for example, those that currently don't have might have transitional governments, or I don't think Madagascar, which is in the Risk Poll, has a good government at all. They're kind of almost quite anarchistic. And yeah, similar with the sorry, just looking indigenous and local knowledge systems as well. There's kind of measures on individual level measures of where people get their information from, but there's already in terms of variable selection, there's already 17, 18 in the model, and we don't want to kind of encounter estimation issues. We did use a lasso tool to select the most relevant variables within the data set, and that was what the ones that we ended up with were ideal for the models that we needed to estimate.
Thank you. While I've still got you, Jack, I'll ask you another question. And that is, do you think the higher level comparison calls for particular case studies or comparisons of the issues discussed? I guess that's what's next in terms of the research.
Yeah, so I don't think the high level comparison calls for case studies in a purely descriptive sense, but it does provide a good way to select them. So again, one of the advantages of the data that we use is in our modeling strategy is that it allows us to identify systematic cross-national variation. And an example of that might be where either governance quality or disaster exposure might condition individual level effects. So as opposed to picking cases arbitrarily, the data allows us to identify most different or most similar cases along dimensions that actually matter statistically. So we might look at, and this is something that shows up in our cluster analysis that allowed us to select focal countries. There might be high governance, high GDP countries with lower natural hazards, lower income versus and contrasting that with countries that have lower GDP but higher disasters, for example. And that allows our kind of case studies to probe mechanisms behind the patterns that we see in the data. And again, that would be important for designing early warning systems and communication effectiveness, as opposed to kind of you know, on a descriptive basis.
Thank you. I understand what you're saying now. Thank you very much. There's a few questions now for Paula. One is perhaps a comment where someone has suggested maybe the word cancellation itself is the problem in that scenario you presented. Do you have a perspective about that?
I don't want to say all the bureau shouldn't be using that, given I have 3 bureau colleagues in the room who, you use that. It is a message that is cancelled. Yeah. So another alternative that we've seen elsewhere is this event has now concluded, or this message is now outdated, or something like that. Depending on if it is an actual conclusion to an event message, or there is a message that now supersedes this. So there are other alternatives to cancellation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. There's a question from another Met agency saying, are the warning messages referring to each other's sending agencies to provide user guidance on additional information with potential disclaimers for inconsistency?
Yeah, absolutely. So your bureau messages always refer to the relevant agency. So see New South Wales SES for more instructions, or if it was a fire event, see Queensland Fire, for instance, for more direction. And the same happens for response agencies. They always refer back to and stay tuned with the Bureau for any updated weather information. So that absolutely happens. But as far as I know, there's not yet any disclaimers around consistency or inconsistency, or considering the absence of.
Yeah. And thank you for that. The last, and I think you've answered it in the chat, but I think it's interesting to go to this question about coordination between agencies. And I guess the challenge of, especially for rapidly evolving events like severe weather and thunderstorm, the potential risk around coordination actually delaying message dissemination. Do you think this is something that's a consideration?
Yeah, so I just said in the chat, obviously I should defer to the operational colleagues. However, my 10 cents on the issue is maybe this is the opportunity where, if the Bureau is the legally responsible, first warner, that maybe you do need a sentence in there that says SES may not have a warning out, or some kind of disclaimer there, so that people aren't saying, oh, well, I'm just going to wait till SES says something and then I'll make a decision on how to act, which we've seen again in other contexts where a fire's been moving too quickly and the fire agencies don't even know that the fire is there yet. They haven't detected it, so they can't send a message. So maybe there is something to learn from earthquakes, which are probably our most rapid onset events that we warn for.
Okay, thanks, Paula. And then this is a question to any of the presenters from Philip, who was very involved in organising the first session we had today, which was within surveys, if any of us within their surveys explored the consequences of agencies communicating a warning on aspects related to weather, but not the weather itself, fire, floods, etc., because a weather warning renders a different perception than the associated event. So, Philip, I think, are you asking about the difference between weather warnings and impact warnings? You're very welcome to come on and explain your point.
Yeah, like in general, I think we can open the floor maybe for the last bit, right? Just ask people to. Yeah.
He's going to join, I think. Disconnecting his microphone.
Maybe that Andrea wants to respond to that. She's raising her hand.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I do apologize for that.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, I'll also put on my camera. I don't know if I can, but maybe I can. So hi, hello everyone, and thank you for giving me the floor. Yeah, I just had a question more general to all the presenters and participants. I really enjoyed each and every aspect of that session. There was a lot of information on different accounts, but yeah, the question I had is if there is a difference in you know, the perception that you get within your surveys, if you ask that kind of questions, coming from information on the weather versus the event. Because let's say we have saturated soils, we have high river levels, and then we have a rainfall warning, which I guess for the weather organizations, it's kind of the baseline. We issue a rainfall warning rather than the flood warning, right? So how best to represent that information? Whether have you researched in your surveys a difference between the message that the rainfall warning gives than a flood warning would give? Because again, different accounts may be different. I would say you know, responsibilities, because the med organizations might not have the responsibility to issue the flood warning. That might be within the local authority. So I wonder whether any of you had a contact with that kind of survey outcomes, I guess.
So with the data that we used for our project, no, it just asks about weather generally, which we did find slightly problematic just in parsing out those differences that you highlighted. It is something that we're aware of and that we do kind of reflect on in our reports, and we've got a paper of this under review at the minute as well, and it's a limitation that we recognise given the data that we've used.
All right, yeah, I guess that makes sense. I also thought in terms of, for example, what Paula was hinting on, that maybe there are different agencies that have different responsibilities and warnings, and that there is an alignment or disalignment. So in this sense, also, you know, there can be a rainfall warning and a flood warning at different levels from different agencies, and how that perception comes from the public then. So that was another thought that I had.
And maybe Carla can correct me if I'm wrong, but in Australia, any response agency, so if SES was going to say something about flooding, they would include Bureau information about it, rainfall or anything else that they might have warned about. And it's always cross-populated. So see here for more instructional information or weather information, because even though I explained about New South Wales, every state and territory has a completely different who's in charge model, but everybody cross-posts information.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, Carla, you're like you go.
I was just going to respond to Paula, and then we'll go to Andrew Tupper, and then we'll go back to Machiel to manage the conversation. So Paula, actually, not always the agencies refer back to the Bureau of Warnings, so that there's actually, it's not always a two-way communication, actually, so just for clarification. But we'll hand to Andrew, and then
thanks, Paula. I appreciate that. I'm going to put on a hat here. I'm WMO Pillar Lead for Pillar 2 in Early Warnings for All. And I really want to make the point that under the Sendai framework, all of our countries have signed up to provide multi-hazard early warning systems. And I think from that perspective, it's really important that the public in general don't care who's responsible for this tsunami or the eruption or the flood or the lahar or the landslide that's hit them, or whether they're being hit by a multi-hazard, multidisciplinary event. They want to be safe. They want to have good information that informs them. So this work of stitching the warnings together to provide an integrated, credible, usable whole is absolutely critical to what we do. And in that context, this discussion is just wonderful, and thank you everyone for it. But it's most important that when we write warnings, we're thinking about the big picture and stitching together the agencies that are delivering that together. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Andrew. And I also saw that also Jeff was picking up on the discussion now online. Jeff, would you like to express your point also regarding the the impact-based let's say warnings, let's say live? Feel free.
Hey, hope you can hear me. There's a bit of an issue with the camera, but yeah, so it's not really about the survey, but we held a focus group before, and although there is no impact-based warning in Luxembourg as of yet, the warnings are treated as such depending on the level of warning in terms of the color code. So we held a focus group where we asked the participants basically first to say what sort of terminology would you put for this type of warning, so whether that's a danger or and so on and so forth, and also then interpret what sort of impacts the different warnings bring, so whether it's rainfall warnings or weather warning or flood warnings, and basically the connection between a rainfall warning producing a flood was only made once a certain threshold was met. So usually for most it was once it was an orange warning for rainfall, like a orange weather warning, people started to think, okay, this maybe could bring some flooding. Like before that, it was not part of their anticipatory like sort of thinking, even for planning. And I'm talking about officials here, not the population.
Thanks. Yeah, like an example that I could bring in that I was thinking about in this context is that in the polar regions, in the Arctic region, what you see in maritime yes, let's say conditions is sometimes let's say icing, right? As an example, it's a particular condition that emerges, but that is dependent on really a different range of circumstances, whereby a ship, let's say, freezes over completely by seawater that is frozen, and it's really a combination of waves with wind, with sea temperature, with air temperature. These kind of very specific but still very impactful conditions, they really require, let's say, not only coupled models, as they say, right? But so between met and let's say sea conditions and things like this, but also let's say really knowing from the users so how impactful and how less difficult some of these conditions are if they emerge, because they would want to know it in these wordings, right? There's an icing risk instead of there's a wave or there's a particular, let's say, temperature or wind, right? So that's also a very nice example how sometimes, it's really the combination of the conditions that matters. Yes, we could continue on this track for a bit more, but we could also move back to another interesting discussion that was held in the previous session, when also I noticed that some of you were discussing the role of social media and the role of really different types of information channels. Let's say the formal ones, but also the more informal social media challenges. Channels, the platforms. There's really a how do you say that? Like a plurality of different information channels that could also, let's say, confuse or flood, let's say, literally users and communities with information. And the best way of going about that, it was mentioned, what kind of difference should be take into account. Are not every social media is maybe the same in that sense. So I was also wondering if there's any interesting, perspectives there or examples of how that matters, or of how we take these different media channels into account. Is there anyone who would like to speak to that or respond to that? Andrea?
Hi. So I think that for me, this is something that really warrants further exploration. Firstly, because so different platforms have very different audiences. And so if you're trying to reach all audiences, it may be a question of how do you engage on different platforms, because I think there are very few, for instance, young adults using Facebook these days. Another point is that the usage is very dynamic, so it needs to be tracked over time, either because platforms fall off or because they stick with the initial cohort who sticking with the platform. Again, Facebook would be an example. So I think we often talk about social media as something perhaps a bit more cohesive than it actually is. And I think someone mentioned in the chat earlier that sometimes there might be a sort of overlap between what we would consider an instant messaging app versus what we would consider actual social media. And I don't think that this is something that's necessarily been investigated yet as cohesively as it probably should be.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Paula?
We recently, in another project, did a systematic review of the last 10 years of platform use, of which social media is a platform in this space. And we found that there were effectively like 3 categories of research. One, papers looking at how people use Twitter, which, take what you will from the generalizability of that. And then the next bucket was where people indicated out of all the channels that they were getting information from, they would indicate social media, but it would just be at that level of detail. So you don't know if that's your official agency Facebook page or if they're using TikTok, which is not helpful if you as an agency are not on TikTok. And then the last part is just looking at like more broadly relations and actors that are important in modeling how information flows on social media, which again was sometimes Facebook, but mostly Twitter. So I think the sector has a great opportunity to dive a little bit deeper into what do we actually mean by, oh, I use social media, or I get my warnings from social media, which could quite literally be a friend posting something, not actually any official information. So there's a huge opportunity here.
Yeah, I see. Any other responses or any other topic that you feel we could address in the context of the presentations we've heard overall today? The floor is open. Andrea?
Yeah, sorry to button again, but I think that something that's been raised today, particularly in the last talk, was the question about ensuring the validity and quality of the data that we're gathering. So I guess an open question that I would have is, what are the best sources of data and information that we can use to, I guess, verify or to complement what we're gathering using these kind of more traditional survey-based methods? So obviously we had the example from Indonesia of app analytics, but I think there's this broader question of what other sources of data might be available to us as those who are taking some kind of social science approach to looking at user needs for weather information.
That's a good one. Yeah. And then I think you mean, so in terms of doing research and understanding what the value of these different, let's say information or data, let's say could be, huh? Are there any interesting views on this, on maybe types of data that we haven't discussed yet, or types of data that are out there that could be really relevant? remains a bit quiet, but maybe.
Okay, happy to jump in.
Yeah, Paula.
And I
You're
don't
the
again, I
savior.
want to answer the question. But I think going back to Lisa's point earlier around the value and importance of qualitative research and actually physically being out in community, especially after an event, is so important, assuming it's done very trauma-informed. That's where you're going to get the richest insights. The user experience data is so important. And I think agencies are tapping into that now more and more, looking at the panic downloads and if that translates. But there's got to be, I think we need to look to a way of how can, when a warning goes out, you can find a way to connect with a group of people and sort of collect data in real time. What decision are you making? What did you do next? Why did you do that? In a way that's not going to inhibit them from life-saving behavior. I'm just not sure how we move forward. I'm so hesitant about surveys. I'm just so worried about bots and why we're paying market research panels $5,000, $6,000, $8,000, $25,000, for data that you have to clean so many times. I'll get off the soapbox. Someone else can answer.
I think in general, it's also just really important. I mean, it was already mentioned several times. Let's say the value of qualitative data is to also for ground truthing in a way, whether what we are seeing in big data types of analytics is really what we are. So it's really tempting to think that we are looking at a particular trend or a particular phenomenon, while in reality it might be something. It might be something else. Like I have a colleague, for example, who was researching. Who was doing a lot of this kind of ground truthing research on the issue of climate migration. So it's very tempting to always see in relation to a particular weather event, like a movement of people that are moving from A to B, and then to kind of generally label that as being a climate refugees or climate migration or something like this. But what you often see once you start talking to why these people are moving, or what is actually happening, why are these mobile phone data suddenly showing these kind of movements, that there's actually something else going on. It has nothing to do with the with the event. So it's really important to also to check and to ground truth some of these things before we are, let's say, very easily copying and maybe amplifying some of these more alarmist views, because there's also oftentimes other factors going on. Are there any other views on this, on alternative types of data? There are huge opportunities there. Other examples? If not, we could also, Carla, move towards the last couple of minutes, or the last thing that we wanted to do. You mentioned how you had a small summary.
I did mention that. So I guess the small summary I was going to make was actually to just draw out some of the themes that I think have come through from all the talks. And so I've just lost my spot. So it's interesting that we've still heard quite a lot about both the hazards of heat and flood. And I'm really curious to understand the underpinning challenges around those two hazards. For one is heat wave. We see fairly low risk perception around that and some sort of normalisation of the risk. But in parallel, we also have quite poor data about the lives lost and hospital admissions, certainly in Australia, as a result of that hazard. And then the other thing that seems to be coming through a lot is the challenge of warning for flood. And I think, interestingly, in the chat, we've seen flood tends to be a multi-agency hazard. So I know there was a comment in the chat, UK Met Service, talking about that they don't warn for flood, the Environment Agency does. And in Australia, and also Jeff DeCosta talked about different levels of government having different responsibilities. we have kind of quite strange division between riverine flood and flash flood or fast onset flood, and I know that's and certainly presents a particular communication challenge. So I think that's a very interesting theme that's come through. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done about the methods. That really was the beginning of the topic, and we started with Katja being quite challenging to sort of say, you know, that the shape of the survey instrument can really be influential in the outcomes that you get and the insights you get. And I think that's been reinforced a little bit by some of the discussions that have been had. And then as we've moved into a little bit of a conversation about the need for multi-method approaches to actually look at different ways and different sources of data to make sure we're getting some meaningful information. The other thing that really came through for me was this discussion about risk perception and sort of going from small data sets, national level data sets, to multi-country data sets. Very influential seems to be recency of hazard exposure and age seem to be really big things in influencing how people see or perceive their risk. So that's interesting. Maybe as we all get older, we become more cautious and become more risk aware. But it is also interesting to think of all the myriad of factors that we try and consider as being influential, and maybe they're not quite as much as they were. I think the other area is really this very untapped question around the role of social media as another channel, both formal and informal, and how it's going to influence. I think there's a bigger conversation that we have about formal and official warning agencies, but then there's another, and whether there's a threat in a sense from other informal provision of warnings, but also the opportunity that exists to use other channels to get the message out more fulsomely. But I think, you know, I think Andrea's mentioned it and Paula, we kind of don't really know enough. It's definitely a research gap. And I do think it's interesting, lastly, the question around the sampling, like who are we talking to and how do we actually talk to people? And increasingly we say, we acknowledge like we're having an impact as social scientists in encouraging people to say, you need to talk to your community, you need to talk to people, but actually there's still a lot of work to do to make sure we're talking to the right people in the right way. I don't know if you want to add to that, Machiel?
Yeah, I had one more comment I wrote down also during the sessions today about how I feel that also on this topic on collecting user insights, I find it really inspirational to see how this really brings together, maybe, let's say maybe more applied researchers working in med institutions who are working on this, let's say often in a more applied way around certain products, around the services of their institutions, but also sometimes in collaboration with maybe researchers at universities or other types of institutes. And I think the kind of dialogues between the two and the collaborations between these two, or within these two groups, are very worthwhile. So I also see, I think with this session we made, I think also a very nice contribution in that sense, and maybe opened up, I think a lot of discussion and interesting insights for let's say the field of weather and society in general. So I leave the final word to you, Carla, still.
Oh, no, thank you very much. We've got a couple of last slides. Isha, I think, is going to share some slides. So just some extra bits. One is that we want to just draw your attention to this special issue that's being prepared, special collection for weather and climate-induced multi-hazard futures, and encourage people to contribute to this, this journal, which is going to be looking for contributions through the Weather and Society conference. Next slide, please. The other thing is that we've been running a survey through the Sarah Working Group with Yelma from the Met Norway for looking at a survey for social science capacity and experiences at Met and Hydro and Geological Institute. So we're looking to understand the sorts of things that people are doing about whether there's social science capacity within organisations or whether that's being provided by partners and other academic institutions. So if you are one of those people, please take a little look at that QR code and respond to the survey, which only takes a few moments. And lastly, of course, we have a feedback survey. And this is the third time we've run this conference. We're really trying to make it better and better every time. So any feedback that you've got is very much appreciated. So if you would take the time to respond to the survey, that'd be great. If you don't want to do it now because it's too late, like it is for me, nearly 11 o'clock at night, we'll be sending out that link with the final wrap-up email. So I think that's all. And just, of course, lastly, to say many, many thanks to all the speakers and presenters and people who participated. And yeah, really look forward to seeing you at one of the next 2 sessions over the next couple of days that are still coming on. So thanks all.
Thanks, Carla, also for co-hosting. It was a pleasure as usual, and also from my side. Have a nice day and have a nice night.